Hey there, and welcome back. If you are settling in right now, if the day has finally released you, and you are letting the weight of it drop somewhere beyond the blanket, somewhere out into the dark past the curtains and the quiet of the room, good. That is exactly what tonight asks of you, because the story we are stepping into this evening is one that has no comfortable ending, and no easy moral, and no moment at which everything resolves into the peace you might have hoped for. And yet it is one of the most extraordinary lives in the history of England, and a life that has been misunderstood almost from the moment it ended. It is the story of a woman who arrived on these shores at 15 years old, speaking almost no English, carrying a diplomatic treaty her homeland hoped would finally end a war, and who spent the next 4 decades fighting, losing, grieving, and fighting again with a ferocity that her contemporaries, friend and enemy alike, found extraordinary, often frightening, and occasionally, in their more honest moments, magnificent. There is a moment we will reach tonight that I want you to hold at the back of your mind as we go. A queen sitting alone in a cold room in France, a pen in her hand, a document spread on a plain table before her, men who had once been her enemies standing at the edges of the room and watching. She picks up the pen. She puts her name on the document. She sets the pen back down. And in that moment, everything she has spent 30 years fighting for is formally, legally, and finally over. She had very little choice but to sign. She had known, in some part of herself for some years, that this day would come. The question tonight is not whether she lost, because she did lose, and with a completeness that is hard to look at directly, but who she was on the long road that led to that room, and what she carried with her down that road, and what she could not bring herself to put down, even when every sensible calculation argued that she should. Tonight we are going into the 15th century, into the world of the Wars of the Roses, though we are going to live that world through a pair of eyes that most histories have either overlooked or misrepresented. We are going to spend this evening with Margaret of Anjou, not the she-wolf of the Tudor propagandists, not the raging villainess of Shakespeare's history plays, and not the sainted Lancastrian martyr of later romanticists either, though there is something, some grain of a difficult truth, in each of those versions that still points back toward the actual person. Just a woman, born in the province of Anjou in the early spring of 1430, raised at a brilliant and chronically impoverished court, married at 15 into the slow structural collapse of an English royal house, and left, for most of her adult life, to hold that house together alone with whatever she could find. Before we go any further tonight, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I would love it if you took a moment to do that now, because it costs you nothing, and it is how you find your way back here on the next evening when the day has been too much, and you need somewhere quiet to go. If you are listening from somewhere interesting tonight, please leave it in the comments when you wake. I read every single one, and the range of places and circumstances and lives from which people listen to these episodes genuinely moves me every time. The comments on episodes like this one contain some of the most thoughtful exchanges you will find anywhere, and if you browse them in the morning, you might find that too. Picture this: the valley of the Moselle River in the very last days of winter, 1430. The province of Lorraine sits in what is now the northeastern corner of France, a landscape of low wooded hills and river meadows, of small fortified towns cut from the local sandstone and perched on ridges above the water, of orchards and vineyards descending long gentle slopes toward wide grey-green river courses that run cold and dark through February and begin to quicken and brighten as March arrives and the light slowly shifts. It is into this landscape, into a ducal palace in the town of Pont-à-Mousson, that looks out over a bend in the Moselle, that a girl is born on the 23rd of March. Her parents are René, Duke of Anjou, and of Lorraine, and Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine, a woman of the old noble House of Lorraine who has spent years managing the practical realities of her household and her husband's precarious affairs with a competence that René's more theatrical temperament does not always supply. They name their new daughter Marguerite. In the Latin of later documents, Margaret. She is the second daughter of a family that will grow large, spread wide, and leave its mark across several thrones at once, though none of those thrones will hold them comfortably for long. This is the world she is born into, not a restful one, but a vivid, serious, and formative one, and it will mark her for the rest of her life. For the first several years of Margaret's life, the defining fact of her world is her father, and understanding René of Anjou is essential to understanding the woman she becomes, because his influence over her is visible in almost everything she later does, from the way she runs a court to the way she endures catastrophe, and because her story is, in some deep structural sense, a repetition of his, the same pattern of legal right and personal brilliance, meeting the hard limits of military and financial reality, and losing. René of Anjou is among the most remarkable personalities of the 15th century, a century not short of remarkable personalities. He holds, at various points in his life, an almost comically impressive accumulation of titles. He is Duke of Anjou, Duke of Lorraine, Count of Provence, Count of Guise, and by various lines of inheritance and conquest, he is also, at different moments, King of Naples, King of Sicily, and titular King of Jerusalem. The last three of these are what contemporaries call nominal claims, crowns that exist in heraldry and legal assertion rather than in the administration of actual territory. René is taken to Naples to fight for the Neapolitan throne, campaigns with energy and considerable personal courage, and loses the kingdom to the Aragonese. He fights for Lorraine, is captured, and spends years as a prisoner while his wife Isabella manages his ransom in careful installments. The kingdom of Jerusalem he never attempts to reach. What René actually is, beneath the considerable wreckage of his political ambitions, is an artist of genuine accomplishment and a man of vivid intellectual life who has been placed in a role that requires him to do something else entirely. He composes verse in Provençal and in French with real skill. His works have been studied by scholars of the period and found to have genuine literary quality. He illuminates manuscripts with his own hands, producing miniatures that are examined with admiration by art historians looking at them without always knowing who painted them. He organizes tournaments of legendary elaborateness, theatrical spectacles of chivalric form in which the ceremonies of medieval knighthood are staged with a seriousness and a care for visual splendor that makes them as much religious theatre as martial exercise. He is a patron of extraordinary generosity, given the chronic inadequacy of his finances, surrounding himself with poets, musicians, painters, and scholars, and sustaining them with a hospitality that his treasury perpetually struggles to fund, and that he seems congenitally unable to curtail. The court that Margaret grows up in is, as a result of her father's personality, a court of real cultural life and genuine intellectual ambition, wrapped in a package of recurrent financial anxiety and political instability. It moves between locations as René's circumstances require. Nancy in Lorraine, with its northern gravity and its serious ducal architecture, Angers in the main valley, on its dark schist ridge above the river, surrounded by mild green countryside. Aix-en-Provence in the south, utterly different, with its limestone hills and its blue sky, and its sharp resinous summer smell, and the long liquid light of Provençal afternoons that turns everything it touches richer than it is in ordinary light. Margaret experiences all of these worlds before she is 10. This breadth of geographical and cultural experience, moving between north and south, between the austere and the opulent, between different languages and customs and cuisines and architectures, gives her a quality of flexibility and adaptability that many people of her rank and period simply do not have. She knows from childhood that the world comes in different versions, and that the version you are currently in is not the only one. Her mother Isabella of Lorraine is less extensively documented than René, which is itself a kind of historical injustice. What the record does show is a woman of real practical intelligence and emotional fortitude, someone who manages the household and the accounts and the diplomatic relationships that René cannot always be relied upon to sustain, who raises the children and holds the family together through the periods when René is away campaigning or imprisoned or simply absorbed in one of his artistic projects to the exclusion of the ordinary management of life. She is, in the limited picture the sources allow, the person who gets things done, who pays attention to the practical details that the brilliant and distracted man beside her tends to overlook. She dies in 1453, before the worst of Margaret's crises begin, and we cannot know what she might have said to her daughter in those years. But Margaret's later capacity for endurance, for holding herself together under conditions that would have broken many of the men around her, for maintaining composure and forward momentum when everything argues for collapse, feels like something learned early, from the watching of a woman who got up every morning and did the work without waiting to be thanked for it. The court's cultural life shapes Margaret in ways she may not have fully articulated, even to herself. She absorbs her father's conviction that beauty matters and that the creation of beautiful things is a form of seriousness, not an escape from it. She absorbs his understanding that the dignity of a court is expressed in its culture as much as in its military capacity. She absorbs his love of books, his pleasure in the elaborate ceremonial theatre of courtly life, his belief that the forms of civilization are worth maintaining even when the resources to maintain them are limited. All of this will inflect everything she does in England, the care she takes over the court's appearance and ceremony, the seriousness with which she approaches her public role, the conviction she maintains even in exile that dignity is not a luxury, but an argument, a statement about the legitimacy of the people making it. A court that looks like a court is still a court. A court that has given up looking like one has already conceded something essential. But she also absorbs, less pleasantly, the lesson of her father's political life. The lesson is specific, that the rightness of your legal claim, the brilliance of your personality, the quality of your court and your culture are worth very little against the military and financial power of someone who has decided to take what you have. René spends most of his adult life winning kingdoms and then losing them, building coalitions that fracture, finding resources that prove insufficient. Watching the careful work of years dissolve in the field or in the negotiating room when the people he is dealing with turn out to have more soldiers or more money than he does. He is not a failure in any simple sense. He achieves things of genuine and lasting value. But he cannot hold what he wins, and the gap between his aspirations and his capacity to enforce them is the central fact of his political biography. Margaret watches this pattern, year after year, first as a child who does not fully understand it, and then as a young woman who does. She files it somewhere, in the running account she keeps of the world, and the filing will shape her later with a kind of terrible irony, because she will repeat the pattern with such fidelity that you begin to wonder whether what she took from watching her father was not a warning, but a template. She will win kingdoms and lose them. She will build coalitions that fracture. She will come breathtakingly close to success, and then fall back into catastrophe with a regularity that mirrors his trajectory with unnerving exactness. Perhaps what she learned from him was not how to avoid the pattern, but how to endure it. Get up. Try again. This is what you do when the world does not cooperate with your rightful claims. You do not stop. You keep going. It is the one thing that has always distinguished René of Anjou from the men who simply accepted their defeats, went home, and it is the one thing that will distinguish his daughter. Her education follows the pattern appropriate to a girl of her rank and her family's cultural commitments. She learns to read in French and Latin, and both languages will be tools she uses for the rest of her life, conducting correspondence, reading political documents, following the arguments of councils and courts. She learns music, the lute and the singing of the polyphonic forms that the courts of the period favour. She learns to ride and becomes genuinely accomplished at it, someone comfortable on horseback over long distances in difficult weather, which will prove useful. She learns the ceremonial grammar of a medieval court, the rules of precedence and address, the choreography of processions and receptions, the art of being watched and of performing for an audience while appearing not to perform at all. She reads history and romance and religious text, and the poetry of Macaut and Christine de Pizan, and the chronicles that give shape to the past. She reads attentively, not for entertainment alone, but in the way of someone who is always trying to understand how things work and why they go the way they do. She is described by those who meet her as a child and teenager, as dark-eyed, vivid, beautiful in the style of her family, rather than the fairer northern type that northern France and England tend to prize. She has an intensity of manner that different observers read differently. The quality of seeming completely present in whatever room she is in, of giving full attention to what is happening around her and what the people in the room are actually doing and meaning, can read as charisma and warmth, and often does. It can also read, in different circumstances or to different viewers, as something more watchful and less comfortable. The quality of a person who is always registering and adding what she sees to the account she keeps. Both of these readings are probably correct, reflecting different moments of the same underlying quality. She is not passive, not decorative, not easily overlooked. She is, from an early age, the kind of girl whose intelligence fills rooms, who asks questions and forms opinions, and is not entirely willing to keep those opinions in the places that the conventions of her world assign to the opinions of girls. She grows up in a France that is still technically at war with England, though the 100 Years' War is, by the time she is old enough to understand it, visibly in its final phase. Joan of Arc has been burned at Rouen in 1431, the year after Margaret's birth, but the momentum Joan created for the Dauphin, now Charles VII, did not die with her. The English position in France has been deteriorating steadily for 2 decades. They are losing territory, losing morale, losing the political argument for why a war that has cost a century of blood and treasure is still worth continuing. By the early 1440s, the pressure on both sides to arrive at some settlement, some way to acknowledge the shape of the world that the campaigns have actually produced and call it a peace, is building toward a point at which someone will have to give something genuinely valuable away. Margaret of Anjou will be that thing. She is 15 when the decision is made, and the historical record contains no evidence that anyone asked her opinion about it. The marriage negotiations that will deliver Margaret to England begin seriously around 1444. England at this moment is theoretically governed by Henry VI, who has been king since the age of 9 months. When his father Henry V died in France in August 1422, at the apparent peak of his triumph, master of Normandy, recognised heir to the French throne, the greatest English military king since Edward III. Henry V died of dysentery at 35, which is one of those moments when the complete indifference of biology to the ambitions of statecraft becomes absolute. The baby left behind has now been King of England for more than 20 years. He is in his early 20s, unmarried, and presenting his council with a succession problem of real urgency. A king without a queen is a dynasty without a future. And England in the 1440s is a country with enough existing problems that adding dynastic uncertainty to them seems actively dangerous. The man most centrally involved in arranging the marriage is William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, the dominant figure in English court politics at this moment. Suffolk is a veteran of the French wars, a man who has been fighting on French soil since his 20s, and who has arrived through 30 years of experience and observation at the deeply uncomfortable conclusion that England's military position in France cannot be recovered. He is not a coward and not a defeatist. He is a man who has looked at the evidence and drawn the conclusion the evidence supports. And that conclusion is that the only way to preserve what remains of the English position is through a negotiated settlement. The route to a negotiated settlement that Charles VII will consider requires a royal marriage. The name that emerges from the preliminary discussions is Margaret of Anjou, daughter of René, niece by marriage of Charles VII, young enough to bear children, intelligent and capable by the reputation that the diplomatic network has assembled about her. What Suffolk does not fully advertise in the early stages of these negotiations is the price, because there is a price. And it is one that English public opinion will not bear if it is known too early. Charles VII, speaking through his representatives, will agree to the match and to a 2-year truce in exchange for the cession of the counties of Maine and Anjou, English-held territories that the French regard as rightfully theirs and that England has been holding as spoils of the war. The cession of Maine and Anjou will become, when it becomes public knowledge, one of the great political scandals of the reign of Henry VI. It is the fact that the Duke of York and his allies will use as evidence of the corrupt and incompetent management of the realm by the king's favourites. It is one of the direct causes of Suffolk's eventual destruction. But in 1444 and 1445, the bargain is struck quietly, and Suffolk travels to Nancy in Lorraine to meet the bride. The meeting at Nancy is recorded in several sources, and they agree on the essentials. Margaret is gracious, composed, and curious in a way that impresses Suffolk, who has been around courts and royal daughters long enough to recognise the difference between performed composure and genuine one. She asks about Henry and about England with what sounds like real interest rather than diplomatic ritual. She engages with the practicalities of her new situation rather than retreating into the ornamental deference that convention might have expected from a 15-year-old girl being inspected by a foreign earl. Suffolk returns to England and reports to his colleagues that she is exceptional. His colleagues, on the whole, take his word for it. The proxy marriage takes place in Nancy in March 1445. Conducted according to the procedures that canon law has developed for the marriage of parties separated by distance. A representative stands in for Henry, the vows are exchanged, the documents are signed, and Margaret is, legally, Queen of England before she has set foot in the country. The preparation for her actual crossing is elaborate and complicated, as the preparation for such crossings always is. A fleet is assembled, a household is composed from a combination of French attendants she brings from Anjou and English women sent over to join her. A wardrobe is assembled, the ceremony of her reception planned in sufficient detail to manage its public appearance while managing the treasury's limitations. She is, from the moment she leaves Anjou, a piece of state theatre as much as a human being, the embodiment of a diplomatic arrangement that has been years in the making. The Channel crossing in April 1445 is rough. April in the English Channel is unpredictable in the best years, and this particular April is actively difficult, with storms that scatter ships and delay the fleet for several days, and confine the new queen to a heaving cabin for longer than anyone had planned. When she arrives at Portsmouth, delayed and off schedule, there is a letter waiting from Henry. He has ridden down to Hampshire to meet her. He is very eager to see her. Everything is prepared. It is the letter of a man who means every word, who is genuinely excited, who has been looking forward to this meeting with an uncomplicated enthusiasm that his situation and his character have not yet taught him to distrust. The meeting itself takes place at Titchfield Abbey in Hampshire, a short ride from the port. Henry VI is 23 years old, tall and thin, with the indoor pallor of a man who spends most of his time in chapel or library rather than in the field. The descriptions of him that survive from contemporaries across many different political perspectives converge on the same picture with remarkable consistency. He is genuinely and deeply pious, not the performed piety of a man maintaining a useful public image, but the actual organizing principle of a personality, the thing around which everything else in him arranges itself. He attends Mass every day, often twice, and the records of his household show the cost of candles and of the priest's wages with the regularity of a man for whom this is not optional but essential. He founded Eton College in 1440 and King's College, Cambridge in 1441, and these two foundations remain his most lasting achievements. Still standing, still doing the educational work he intended, the most durable things he made in a life that was not, in most respects, structurally durable. He is known to be disturbed by coarse language and to absent himself from rooms in which it is used. He is known to have expressed strong opinions about the immodesty of fashionable dress in women. He is, in all the ways that the 15th century expected of a warrior king, almost perfectly wrong for the role. There is a story told about him in later chronicles, probably embellished, but rooted in something true, in which he stops a royal procession to dismount and kneel in the road to pray when he passes a church. Regardless of the delay, regardless of the rain, regardless of the assembled company of lords and attendants, forced to wait in the mud while their king communes with his God. It is an absurd story and a touching one, and it captures something about him that the political record cannot. He is a genuinely holy man, living in a genuinely unholy world, and refusing, with a consistency that must have required enormous effort, or else no effort at all, to adapt his nature to the demands of the context. There is a kind of integrity in this, though it is not the integrity that serves kingdoms well. It is the integrity of someone who has decided that the most important relationship in his life is not with the lords of England or the King of France or even with his own queen, but with the God to whom he has given everything he has and from whom he expects, in the fullness of time, the only accounting that matters to him. Margaret marries this man. She spends her life fighting for this man. The fighting is, in the end, her tribute to something in him that she cannot replace and that she knows from the beginning she will not be able to save. He is not militarily inclined in the deep instinctive way that the men who successfully commanded armies in this period needed to be. He does not have the political intelligence that would allow him to navigate a factional court without being captured and directed by whichever group reached him first. He trusts people with a completeness that amounts to helplessness, extending the same full confidence to the next person who presents themselves as trustworthy as soon as the previous one has failed him, without any apparent modification of the pattern. He is kind, genuinely and consistently kind, in a way that is noted universally by those who deal with him. He is not a cruel man, or a selfish man, or a stupid man. He is a gentle, scholarly, pious man who has been placed on the throne of a kingdom at war with itself and cannot perform the functions that throne demands. Margaret looks at this man and makes what we must assume was a rapid and thorough assessment. He is charmed with her. The sources agree on this, and there is no reason to doubt it, given his character and the evident attractiveness that the sources attribute to her. He is a man who responds to beauty and to warmth with a simplicity that has not yet been complicated by political calculation. And she is, by all accounts, both beautiful and warm. What she feels in return is not documented in the ways that would allow us to know it clearly. What we can see in everything she does in the decades that follow is that she does not treat him as an obstacle or a burden, does not work against him or around him in ways that suggest contempt or resentment. She appears to have made a decision about the nature of their relationship and to have committed to it completely, the decision that she will provide what he cannot, that she will be the political intelligence and the defensive determination that his position requires and that his nature cannot generate, and that this will be her role and she will discharge it. Whether this was love or duty or something that started as one and became the other, or some compound of both that doesn't reduce to either, is a question we cannot cleanly answer. The marriage is real and the commitment is real, and it lasts in her case for the remainder of her life. They are married formally at Titchfield on the 22nd of April 1445, and she is crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 30th of May, in a ceremony that costs what the Treasury can barely spare and looks as magnificent as the circumstances allow. She is 15 years old, she speaks no English worth mentioning, she is on the throne of England. She does not appear to have found this overwhelming. She appears to have begun paying attention, which is what she will do, as consistently as any other constant in her life, until the very end of it. England in the summer of 1445 is a country in a particular kind of trouble, the kind that does not present itself immediately to the naked eye, but that can be felt by someone paying close attention, in the way that the people in the rooms around you choose their words and their silences. On the surface, things are adequate. The harvest is reasonable. The church is absorbing its customary vast share of national wealth and distributing enough of it to sustain basic function. The towns are doing their trade. The roads are carrying their carts. Nothing is obviously broken. But two pressures building beneath that surface have been accumulating for years, and they are going to keep accumulating until the surface cracks. The first pressure is financial. The campaigns in France have been extraordinarily expensive across a period of more than a century, and the royal treasury has been managing this by borrowing against future revenues, creating a debt to the merchants and magnates who have underwritten the campaigns that the treasury cannot now repay at any speed its income can sustain. Henry V won Agincourt and Normandy and the Treaty of Troyes and was recognised as heir to the French throne. And all of this cost money that England is still paying for, on top of the money spent trying to defend what Henry V won, on top of the money that will be spent on the final phase of losing it. This is not an immediate catastrophe, but it constrains every decision and creates a court in which the question of who controls royal patronage, who receives the lands and offices and customs revenues that constitute meaningful wealth in this world, is a question of political survival for the great magnates who need those revenues to sustain their households and their retaining networks. The second pressure is political, and it grows directly from the first and from the character of the king. Henry VI is, in a practical sense, unable to govern his own court in the way that the 15th century requires. This is not malice or indifference. It is temperament, the collision between who he is and what the role demands. He cannot do the things that effective kingship in this period requires. He cannot read a room and identify the right person to favour and the right person to frighten, cannot manage the distribution of patronage with the strategic calculation that keeps magnates attached to the crown rather than organised against it, cannot project the kind of decisive authority that inhibits the formation of competing factions into the vacuum that his incapacity creates. A competition between the great magnates has been moving steadily, each faction convinced of its own fitness to govern in the king's name, each faction building its networks of alliance and retaining an obligation. The competition has so far been conducted through the channels of council appointments and legal manoeuvre and the careful knife-work of court politics that leaves few obvious marks. But it is building towards something more direct, and the people most deeply embedded in it can sense it building. Margaret learns the contours of this landscape in her first years at the English court with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the knowledge will eventually matter. She is doing the work that is expected of her as a new queen, appearing at ceremonies, charming visiting dignitaries, managing her household, beginning the process of developing the English she will need to operate effectively in this environment. She does all of this well. Contemporary sources note her grace and her composure and the impression she makes in formal settings. But she is also, all the while, watching the court with the same attention she has always paid to rooms full of people, identifying who matters and how, mapping the connections between people and the interests that drive those connections, learning where the fault lines run and who is on which side of them. The faction most immediately visible to her is the one that arranged her marriage. William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and the network of courtiers and clerics that surrounds him. Suffolk is for now dominant. He has the king's trust. He controls the principal appointments. He is the man through whom royal patronage flows. But dominance in the court of Henry VI has always been a conditional thing, dependent on maintaining the king's trust and on the absence of any organised alternative. And the alternative is becoming increasingly organised around the figure of Richard, Duke of York. Richard of York is the most powerful magnate in England in terms of territorial wealth and noble rank. He is also, through his descent from Edward III through the female line, a figure whose claim to the throne is by some arguments at least as strong as Henry's own. A fact that nobody quite articulates openly in these years, but that everybody in the court understands, and that hangs in the air of every conversation about the succession. York is not yet claiming the throne. He is claiming what he presents as the more moderate position, the right to be heard, to have influence commensurate with his rank and his service, to be treated as the significant political actor he is, rather than as someone to be managed and excluded by Suffolk's faction. The grievance is not entirely without foundation. York has governed English possessions in France and in Ireland with genuine competence. He has the kind of administrative ability and military experience that the king's immediate circle conspicuously lacks. He has reason to feel that he has been systematically excluded from the influence he is owed. He has also, from very early in this period, reasons to fear what will happen to him if he does not find a way to protect himself from the faction currently dominant at court, and fear is a very effective political motivator. Margaret observes all of this with the careful attention she has been developing since childhood. She cannot yet do much about it. She is too new, too foreign, too junior in the court's hierarchies of influence to act directly on what she sees. But she is building the map of the terrain, and she understands, with increasing clarity, that the terrain contains a threat that is not going to be managed by the usual mechanisms of negotiation and accommodation. York is not a man who is going to be content with a limited role while the king he regards as his inferior in almost every capacity governs England badly from the position that York believes should be more substantially his own. What Margaret does in these early years, while the court around her is managing its tensions through the established channels of court politics, is establish the relationships and the loyalties that will eventually form the core of the Lancastrian network she will need. She is a queen, and the queen has a court of her own, a household that she controls and that contains the ladies and gentlemen and officers and chaplains and servants that make up her personal world. She uses this world intelligently. The people she favours, the connections she cultivates, the loyalties she establishes in these years through the ordinary mechanisms of queenly patronage and personal warmth, become the foundation of the political operation she will later need to run explicitly and urgently. She is building it before she fully knows she will need it, because she is the kind of person who builds things before she needs them, rather than after. The years between 1445 and 1450 are, for Margaret, years of learning and positioning, years in which the gap between the reality she is preparing for and the role she is being asked to perform in are steadily converging, because the England she is performing in is steadily becoming the England she will need to be ready for. The crisis is coming. She can feel it building, in the same way that you can feel a storm building on a clear morning, not yet visible, but already changing the quality of the air. Before we reach the crisis that the fall of Normandy triggers, there is something worth setting clearly about the marriage in its early years, not as a political arrangement, but as a human one. Because we are too quick sometimes to skip past the human texture of arrangements that are so obviously political. Margaret and Henry are two young people who have been brought together by the requirements of diplomacy and placed in the intimate proximity of a shared household and a shared bed and a shared daily existence that has its own rhythms and its own small textures, regardless of the large political textures around it. He reads to her. The household records contain evidence of his having books brought to the Queen's chambers, and this is the kind of detail that says something small and true about the life inside the formal life. She learns his habits, which are the habits of a genuinely good man, in the specific and limited way that goodness is possible in someone whose goodness has not been complicated by the necessity of protecting itself. Someone who has never needed to be strategic about his kindness because his position has always made the exercise of his kindness safe. She learns that he is moved by beauty, that the illuminated manuscripts he commissions and the music of his chapel bring him to a stillness that looks like peace, that he is capable of a generosity that is not calculated because he has not learned to calculate it. She is not incapable of caring for this. She has grown up around a father who also possessed a kind of uncomplicated generosity of spirit, and the quality is one she knows how to appreciate even when it coexists with the practical incapacity that she is beginning, carefully, to measure. They speak about England together in the way of a couple learning a shared country together. She asks questions, he answers them with the gentle earnestness of someone who genuinely wants to help her understand, who is not strategic about what he shares, who trusts her with the fullness of his honest responses. She is collecting these responses in the account she keeps of the kingdom, filing them alongside everything else, building the map of a kingdom she must learn from the inside rather than the outside. The marriage is real, whatever else it is, and the reality of it is part of what she is fighting to preserve when the world begins to require fighting. The fall of English power in France comes quickly, and it comes in the years when the pressure on the court is already near its peak. By 1449, the 2-year truce arranged alongside the marriage has long since expired without being renewed in any durable form, and the French are advancing with a confidence and a speed that reflects how far the balance has shifted. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, falls in 1449. The towns and fortresses of the Norman duchy that had taken Henry V years of hard campaigning to win are given up in months. By the spring of 1450, English Normandy is effectively gone, a century of military investment dissolved in a single campaigning season. The shock in England is the shock of losing something that people had come to treat as permanent, the particular disorientation of a world that has changed its shape without anyone having clearly seen it change. The recriminations are immediate, and they fall on Suffolk, who has been the architect of the peace policy and who is now held responsible, fairly or not, for the military disaster that followed it. The Commons impeach him in 1450, charging him with treason and misgovernment, and with the secret cession of Maine and Anjou that has now become public knowledge and that reads, in the political temperature of the moment, like a confirmation of everything his enemies have been saying about him. He is sentenced to 5 years of exile. He does not reach it. On his way to France, his ship is intercepted by another English vessel, whose crew has decided on their own authority that Suffolk's safe passage is not something they are willing to honour. They drag him to the side of the boat and kill him with a rusty sword, and his body is thrown into the sea. It is not a dignified end for a man who spent 30 years in service to the crown. And its casual brutality is a measure of how far the political temperature has risen. For Margaret, the loss of Suffolk is personal as well as political. She has valued him as a friend and an ally, one of the few people at court whose support for the Lancastrian position she could depend on, and who understood the nature and the importance of the marriage he had arranged. His removal also reads clearly enough as a signal about the direction of travel, the faction that brought her to England, that managed the peace policy she is associated with, that has been the court's dominant force for the past several years, has been broken by popular violence with what appears to be the approval or at least the acquiescence of forces she cannot control. The opposition to everything she represents is gaining ground, and gaining it through means that the usual mechanisms of court politics have not been able to stop. The loss of Suffolk is also the loss of a specific kind of protection, because Suffolk, whatever his failings, had been the person most consistently positioned between the crown and the worst of the factional pressure. The man who understood that the court needed to be managed strategically, and who had the network and the intelligence to manage it. His removal leaves a gap that cannot be quickly filled, and the gap is immediately visible to everyone who is watching the court with the attention that the situation demands. Margaret is watching with exactly that attention, and what she sees in the months after Suffolk's death is a court that has lost its stabilising centre, and that is beginning to move. Under the pressure of the factions now working without the counterweight of Suffolk's management, toward a shape that she cannot let it take without response. She does not yet have the standing to respond directly. But she is watching, and she is beginning to identify the positions she will need to occupy when the standing becomes available to her. In the same year, the rebellion known as Jack Cade's Rising sweeps through Kent and Surrey and into London with a momentum that shocks the court. Jack Cade is not a nobody. He is someone with military experience and genuine organisational ability. And the manifesto, his rebellion, carries articulate, popular grievances about the corruption of the court and the incompetence of the king's ministers in language that resonates beyond the ranks of the discontented poor. The rebels briefly hold London Bridge. They kill the Treasurer of England in the street. They issue demands that include the removal of Henry's current advisers and the return to influence of Richard of York. They are put down eventually through a combination of negotiation and force, but the ground has shifted. A court now knows that London itself is not reliably stable, that the resentment against what is perceived as the misgovernance of the realm has reached a level at which people will take up arms in the streets of the capital. Richard of York comes back from Ireland uninvited and unannounced, with an armed escort large enough to make the point, and presents himself as the voice of reform, the man who can fix what has been broken by the incompetence and corruption of those around the king. He demands to be heard. He demands to be received. He demands a role commensurate with his rank and his claims. He is technically within his rights to make these demands. He is the greatest magnate in England, and he has not yet committed any overtly treasonous act. But the demonstration is clear. He can appear with armed men whenever he chooses, and the royal government, as currently constituted, does not have a reliable answer for it. Nobody in the court misses the demonstration. Margaret does not miss it. The years between 1450 and 1453 are years of manoeuvring in which the court repeatedly tries and repeatedly fails to find a stable position. Suffolk is replaced. New ministers take up the Lancastrian cause. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, becomes the dominant figure around the king and inherits the enmity that Suffolk's death has not discharged. York presses. The court resists. Agreements are reached and unravel. The competition continues through the channels still available to it, while moving steadily and inevitably toward the channels that are not. Margaret manages her public role, appears at ceremonies, cultivates her network, writes letters, pays attention. She is learning the court with a thoroughness that will eventually give her the intelligence she needs to operate within it on very different terms. She is not idle, and she is not purely decorative. She is building for a future she can feel coming, even if she cannot yet see its exact shape. By the summer of 1453, the daily texture of the court has changed. The conversations in the corridors and the antechambers that are always the true medium of court politics have a different quality from those of the earlier years, more watchful and less candid, with the specific tension of people calculating their words against an uncertain future rather than speaking easily within a settled present. The great lords who attend the council bring their household retinues in numbers that have been quietly increasing. The visible weight of armed men around each magnate is a message delivered without words about the force behind each magnate's position. Margaret reads all of this. She reads the numbers of horses in the courtyards and the faces of the men in the doorways, and the particular way that certain combinations of people choose to sit at a distance from certain other combinations. And she adds what she reads to the account she is keeping. The account is telling her that the time before things change dramatically is measured in months rather than years. The summer of 1453 then produces two events in rapid succession that change the world she has been building in and force her to operate on the new terrain with whatever she has already assembled. In July 1453, the Battle of Castillon, fought in the Dordogne Valley in southwestern France, confirms the loss of Bordeaux, the last major English territory in France, and ends the 100 Years' War in total English defeat. The war that has defined English foreign policy and drained English resources for more than a century is over. England has lost it. The territory that the war was fought to hold, the French lands that had passed to the English crown through inheritance and conquest and 100 years of blood, are gone. The political consequences of this loss, laid on top of the Suffolk scandal and the Norman catastrophe, are severe in ways that will continue to unfold for years. But the immediate domestic consequence is, in some ways, even more pressing. In August 1453, Henry VI goes mad. It is not a gentle or gradual withdrawal. It is a complete and catastrophic collapse of mental function that happens in a short period and leaves no ambiguity about its severity. He sits in a chair and he is not there. He does not speak or speaks without coherence. He does not recognize the people around him, his counselors, his servants, the members of his household who have been with him for years. He is physically alive, breathing, present in the room, in the sense that his body is in it. But wherever Henry is, it is not in this room or in this world. And the doctors who are brought to examine him have nothing useful to offer beyond the standard medical interventions of the period: prayer and bleeding, both of which are tried and neither of which helps. The political consequences are immediate. Without a functioning king, the machinery of royal governance cannot operate normally. Appointments cannot be made, grants cannot be confirmed. The council's authority, which derives from the king's authority, is working without the source it needs. Into this void, Richard of York steps as the constitutionally appropriate solution, the most powerful magnate in England, with the king incapacitated, takes up the role of Lord Protector, governing in the king's name until Henry recovers. It is, in constitutional terms, the correct response to the situation. In political terms, it is precisely the scenario that Margaret most needed not to happen. York, as Lord Protector, can appoint, dismiss, reorganise, and redirect. He does all of these things. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who has been Margaret's most important political ally and one of the key figures of the Lancastrian court, is arrested on charges that the Yorkist faction has been assembling for some time and sent to the Tower of London. York's own men begin appearing in the positions that Somerset and his associates had occupied. Margaret cannot stop this. The Protectorate is constitutionally appropriate, and York is moving within the law. She has no formal standing in governance that would allow her to intervene directly. No mechanism available to her in the legal and political framework of the period through which a queen consort can constrain a Lord Protector who has the support of the council. She can write letters, she can maintain relationships, she can work through the informal channels that are all she has. She does all of these things, but she cannot prevent what is happening, and she knows it. What makes the situation additionally remarkable, in the specifically cruel timing that history occasionally achieves, is that she is pregnant. She has been married for 8 years without producing a child. The absence of an heir has been a source of growing political anxiety. Whispers and more than whispers about whether the Queen is capable of bearing children, about whether the dynasty will have a future in the direct line, about what arrangements might need to be made if it does not. And now, at precisely the moment her husband's mind has gone out like a candle, she is carrying his child. In October 1453, while Henry sits absent in his chamber and York administers England, in his name, Margaret gives birth to a son. She names him Edward, a name that carries a weight of deliberate intention in the Lancastrian world. Edward the Black Prince. The great warrior heir of Edward III, the figure who represents the ideal of what a Prince of Wales should be, brave and decisive and capable, and everything his grandfather Henry V seemed to inherit, and everything his father Henry VI conspicuously is not. The baby is healthy and strong. He is the Prince of Wales. He is the future of the dynasty, the argument in human form for why the House of Lancaster must hold. His father, sitting in his chair in his chamber, somewhere in the palace, does not know he exists. Margaret brings the baby to Henry at some point in the weeks after the birth. The accounts of this visit are sparse and careful, recorded in sources that are more interested in the political implications than in the human texture of the scene. But the scene is there, if you look for it. Henry looks at the child. He looks at the child for what one source describes as a long beat, though what registers behind his eyes during that moment is not recorded. He looks away. He gives no sign of recognition, no expression of feeling, No word. He is elsewhere, in whatever interior country his illness has taken him to, and the new prince is not enough to bring him back. Margaret wraps the child in his blankets and takes him away. I find this moment one of the saddest in her story, and there is a great deal of sadness in her story. She is 23 years old. She has given birth to the child that her husband's dynasty needed and that the absence of, for 8 years, had threatened everything. She is holding the proof that the line continues, that the future is possible, that all of it can still be saved. And the person who should share this with her is somewhere unreachable, in a chair in a room she cannot enter, in a country she cannot reach. And the moment that should have been the most significant moment of shared hope in their marriage is something she experiences entirely alone. She is 23, and she has understood for several years what her husband cannot do. But this particular form of his absence is different from the political inadequacies she has worked around, and the factions she has navigated, and the decisions she has made on his behalf. This is something more fundamental, and it is hers to carry by herself. York, as Lord Protector, governs England for approximately 16 months, from the autumn of 1453 until the early spring of 1455. He governs it, by most assessments, with reasonable practical competence. The machinery of administration keeps working. The peace is maintained, the borders remain stable, but he uses the protectorate to accomplish the political objectives he has been working toward for years, restructuring the patronage networks that have sustained the Lancastrian court, removing his opponents from positions of influence and installing his own people in those positions, dismantling the alliance system that Margaret has been carefully assembling. He does this within the law. He is the Lord Protector. This is within his authority. But the result is that when Henry recovers, as he does in January 1455, the court he recovers into is significantly different from the one he left, with the balance of power shifted toward the Yorkist faction and away from the people who have been most closely associated with the Queen and the King's personal government. Henry's recovery is sudden and apparently genuine. It happens over the Christmas period of 1454, and he comes back to himself with what the sources describe as a completeness that surprises those who have spent 16 months wondering whether he would ever return. Recognizing faces, speaking coherently, understanding his situation, able once again to perform the functions of a king. He sees his son for the first time and reacts with what sounds like uncomplicated joy, the simple delight of a gentle man encountering a healthy child and being told it is his. Somerset is released from the Tower. The Protectorate ends, as it is constitutionally required to end upon the king's recovery. The court reorganizes itself along the lines that Henry's recovery makes appropriate. The court that assembles around the recovered Henry is a court that has spent 16 months under a different management and that has adapted itself to that management with the pragmatic flexibility. Courts always develop in the absence of the authority they are ostensibly serving. The people in it have been doing their calculations. They have been working out which way the wind is blowing, which arrangements will survive the return of the king's effective power, which of the relationships and obligations developed under the Protectorate can be converted into the currency of the new arrangement. Some of them are embarrassed by their recent history. More of them are simply realistic about it. Courts are made of people whose survival depends on being in the right room at the right time, and the right room has just changed. And Margaret, who has been managing an impossible situation alone for 16 months, who has been holding the court together and maintaining the relationships that would need to be maintained, and thinking through the political realities that Henry is constitutionally unable to think through, and protecting her infant son, and watching everything she had spent years building being systematically dismantled by a man she cannot directly confront, has the measure of what she needs to do. She needs to break York's power before he finds a way to complete what the Protectorate has started. She needs to do it with the tools available to her, which are the loyalty of the people who are loyal to the crown, and the intelligence and determination she has been developing for a decade, and a purpose so clear and so non-negotiable that it focuses everything. Her son's inheritance, her husband's throne, the dynasty. Her family has been part of for 30 years, and her son will be part of for the rest of his life. She has had 16 months to think about this. She is ready. In the spring of 1455, the manoeuvring that has been conducted through the channels of court politics for a decade escalates into something that those channels can no longer contain. Both sides can feel it coming. York and his allies, principally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, Warwick's father, read the reorganisation of the court after Henry's recovery and draw the obvious conclusion. The return to power of Somerset and the Lancastrian network means that an accounting for what happened during the Protectorate is coming. In the grammar of 15th century politics, this means danger. The men who acted as York acted during the Protectorate, displacing the king's favourites and reorganising the court. Need either to secure a lasting position or to face the consequences of having done it. They choose to press. In May 1455, they move south toward London with an army, nominally a petition, practically an ultimatum. Henry sends envoys. The negotiations fail. At St Albans, a market town north of London on the road, the royal party is travelling. The Yorkist army attacks the Lancastrian force that has been assembling around the king before it is fully organised and deployed. And in the confused, sharp fighting in the town's streets and gardens, the Lancastrians are routed. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, is killed near the Castle Inn, fulfilling a prophecy that had reportedly been circulating in Lancastrian circles about castles and death. Henry is wounded slightly in the neck by an arrow, not seriously, and is taken into the custody of the victorious Yorkists. He is treated with care. They are not yet at the stage of harming him, and they understand, as everyone in this conflict always understands, that the anointed king is a different category from everyone else. This is the first battle of St Albans, and it is what posterity regards as the opening engagement of the Wars of the Roses. The name is anachronistic. Nobody in May 1455 is thinking in terms of a dynastic war. They are thinking of a political dispute that has escalated into violence and that they hope and expect can be settled through the familiar mechanisms of submission, negotiation, and pardon. What happens after St Albans follows this pattern? York submits, is pardoned, is received back into the machinery of governance. Henry, safe and recovered, takes back the management of his kingdom. The processes of reconciliation proceed. And Margaret, watching all of this from the position of a queen without formal political standing, draws conclusions that the formal processes of reconciliation cannot address. She has understood, with a clarity that Henry's gentle nature either cannot reach or cannot act upon, that this will not resolve itself. The men at St Albans killed a duke and took the king prisoner. They have received pardons, yes. But they know, as clearly as she does, that a fully restored and functioning Lancastrian government will eventually reckon with what happened at St Albans, as it will eventually reckon with the Protectorate and the dismantling of the Lancastrian network that the Protectorate enabled. The pardon is a breathing space, not a resolution. The structure of the conflict now has a logic that is carrying everything towards something final. She has understood this. She begins, from the summer of 1455, to build for it. The building of the Lancastrian position, which Margaret undertakes in the years between 1455 and 1459, is a remarkable political operation. And it is remarkable partly because of what it is conducted against. A queen who has no formal role in governance. In a world where the formal channels of power are all occupied by men, building a military and political coalition through the mechanisms of personal relationships and the informal authority that a queen can exercise without being seen to exercise power directly. She does it through letters, which she writes prolifically, and which the few survivors show to be direct, informed, and strategically precise. She does it through the management of her own household, through the patronage she can distribute, through the personal loyalties she cultivates in the long, patient work of being present and consistent and reliable in a world where those qualities are rarer than they should be. She does it through her son, who grows from the toddler of 1453 into a child of 5 and 6 and 7, who is well and thriving, and who is presented at every opportunity as the visible, vital, healthy future of the dynasty. The network she builds has several nodes. The northern nobility, families like the Cliffords and the Percys and the various branches of the great northern houses, have long-standing grievances against the Nevilles, who are York's principal allies, and long-standing loyalties to the crown that are as much territorial habit as political conviction. Their power bases are in the north. The Nevilles' power bases are also in the north. And the competition between them for dominance in that region is a driver of their Lancastrian alignment as much as any abstract commitment to the House of Lancaster. The West Country nobility have a different calculus. Families like the Courtenays, Earls of Devon, whose commitment to Lancaster goes back several generations and whose social and economic networks are too deeply embedded in the Lancastrian patronage system to be easily detached from it. The Welsh Marcher Lords, with their particular connections to the Lancastrian estates that Henry IV and Henry V had held in Wales. The churchmen, bishops and abbots and cathedral chapters whose foundations and appointments have been made under Lancastrian patronage and who have a practical interest in the continuity of the regime that gave them their positions. Among the specific individuals she cultivates with the most consistent attention these years is Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, the son of the Edmund Beaufort killed at St. Albans, who will become her most important military commander in the campaigns of 1460 and 1461. She sees in him what she sees in the best of the Lancastrian nobility, a man whose family loyalty has been tested and held, whose personal courage has been proved in the field, whose commitment to the cause is not purely calculated, but genuinely personal. Rooted in the grief of what his family has lost and the determination that the people responsible for it will not profit from it permanently. She cultivates him with the directness that characterizes all her best relationships. She is frank with him about what she needs from him and clear about what she can offer in return. And the relationship that develops between them has the quality of a genuine working partnership, the kind that is possible between people who share a purpose serious enough to override the social distances that the period normally maintains. She also works to secure the loyalty of the county gentry, the knights and esquires and men of substance whose local influence shapes the military capacity of the regions, the men who can raise forces when forces are needed, who organize the local administration, who provide the infrastructure of armed resistance at the level below the great magnates. These men are less glamorous and less visible in the historical record than the dukes and earls who command armies, but they are what armies are made of. And Margaret understands this with the practical clarity of someone who has been watching military operations fail for want of the men who should have been there. Running through all of this political work is a domestic life that the political narrative tends to reduce to footnotes, and that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Margaret is a queen, and she is a wife, and she is a mother, and all three of these things are real and human and contain their own textures. Henry, in the periods of stability between the crises, is a husband of a particular kind, gentle and well-intentioned and deeply devoted to his spiritual life and his educational foundations, incapable of protecting her in the ways she needs to be protected, but not cruel, not dismissive, not unkind. She appears to have maintained toward him a loyalty that goes beyond the political calculation that his survival and his continuity in power are necessary to her own position, a loyalty that has something personal in it, something that could plausibly be called affection for the man she has been living beside for a decade, even knowing what he cannot do. Her son Edward is growing up, and watching him grow up is one of the sustained experiences of these middle years. He is healthy and physically vigorous, and apparently spirited, showing by the time he is 4 and 5 the assertiveness and the physical confidence that his father entirely lacks, which is both reassuring because it suggests the dynasty's future will not repeat the dynasty's present, and quietly poignant because the contrast is so visible and it says so much about what has gone wrong. The court watches the contrast between the gentle, psalter-reading king and the energetic, boisterous prince and draws its own conclusions, some of them unkind. Margaret watches it and draws her own conclusions, which are practical. Her son is what she is fighting for, and he is worth fighting for. There is a dimension of Margaret's position in the mid-1450s that the political narrative tends to underweight, which is the degree to which she is exercising real influence while being formally required to exercise none. The constitutional position of a queen consort in England in the 15th century does not include governance. She has no seat on the council, no formal advisory role, no legal standing through which to direct policy or appoint ministers. The law and the custom of the period assign the governance of the realm to the king and his council, and the queen's role, however exalted in ceremony and however rich in the personal influence that proximity to the king allows, is formally distinguished from the governance role in ways that everyone in the court understands. She cannot act as if she governs. She can only govern. The mechanisms through which she does this are the mechanisms that all people with informal influence develop when the formal channels are closed to them. The conversation in the private rooms rather than the council chamber. The recommendation offered to the king in the intimacy of their shared household rather than the public arena of formal advice. The management of appointments at the level of the household and the royal household rather than the great offices of state. The patronage distributed through the Queen's own resources and through the influence over the King's patronage that a thoughtful and consistent Queen can develop over years of attention. None of these mechanisms are invisible. The people in the court are entirely aware that the Queen has views on who should be appointed and who should not, that her favour is worth having and her disfavour worth avoiding, that the most direct route to certain kinds of royal grace runs through the Queen's apartments. This is understood as a fact of court life, not as an usurpation or a violation of the constitutional order. It becomes a violation of the constitutional order in the minds of her opponents only when the Queen's influence is being deployed against them, and in favour of the Lancastrian cause with a consistency and a strategic intelligence that begins to look less like the ordinary exercise of queenly influence and more like the sustained political operation that it actually is, the specific content of what she is fighting for in the mid-1040-50s, beyond the abstract good of the Lancastrian dynasty, is worth making concrete. She is fighting for her son's inheritance, which is the inheritance of an England that has been the greatest kingdom in Northern Europe, the England of Edward III and Henry V, the England that was winning the 100 Years' War and producing the most brilliant culture of chivalric civilization in the world. She is fighting for Henry, who is her husband, and who needs the protection of someone who can see the dangers that his own nature prevents him from seeing. She is fighting for the people whose attachment to the Lancastrian cause has made them as vulnerable as she is. The families who followed the crown through the difficult years and who are now facing the possibility that everything they staked on that following will be lost. These are real and specific stakes, not abstractions, and she carries them as real and specific stakes rather than as political positions, which is one of the reasons she maintains the commitment through conditions that would have loosened a purely political attachment years earlier. That perimeter. The management of her own public image in these years is also a form of political work, though it is easy to overlook it as such. She is always aware of how she appears, of the story that her visible conduct is telling about what she is and what the Queen of England should be. She appears at public ceremonies with the composure and the elegance that her position demands. She is gracious to the people who seek her attention with the warmth that genuine interest in people makes available, rather than the performed warmth of someone going through the motions. She maintains the household with the attention to ceremony and order that reflects her conviction about what a royal household should be. She is visibly devoted to her son, and this devotion, which is completely real, radiates without calculation and produces in the people who witness it an impression of something genuine and therefore trustworthy. The queen who loves her son is a figure that the political culture of the 15th century can accommodate and even admire, even when it is suspicious of the queen who exercises political power. She uses this. The particular form of loneliness that her position involves is not something the historical record allows us to access directly, but it is not invisible if you look at the texture of her situation with sufficient attention. She is managing, effectively and continuously, a political situation of great complexity in a culture that does not formally acknowledge that she is managing it, that requires her to present her management as wifely devotion and maternal instinct rather than as political strategy. Because the admission that it is political strategy would confirm everything her opponents want to say about her. She cannot be the politically capable person she is in the full light of the formal world. She can only be it sideways, in the cracks and the informal channels and the private rooms. The gap between what she is and what she can be seen to be is a form of sustained exhaustion that has no obvious outlet and no formal acknowledgement, and that she carries as she carries everything, without visible complaint. The crisis comes to a head in 1459, and it comes in two phases that together shift the ground irreversibly. In September, a Lancastrian force meets a Yorkist army at Blore Heath in Staffordshire, and the result is a defeat that costs the Lancastrians several hundred men and the momentum they had been building. A few weeks later, at Ludford Bridge in Shropshire, the situation reverses in a different direction. York's army, facing a royal force that is significantly larger than his own, loses its nerve. The Yorkist commanders, rather than fight an engagement they are not sure they can win, scatter. York himself flees to Ireland. His son Edward, Earl of March, and his principal allies, including Warwick and Salisbury, flee to Calais. The flight is ignominious, and it creates a legal window of opportunity. The Parliament that Margaret's government summons at Coventry in the autumn of 1459 uses this window. Acts of attainder are passed against York and his principal supporters, stripping them of their titles and their lands and formally declaring them traitors to the crown. This is the legal mechanism that Margaret has identified as the most effective tool available. It breaks their standing within English law and turns their assets and their authority into possessions of the crown. It is a bold move. It has the legal structure that gives it legitimacy. And Margaret is the driving political intelligence behind it. The person who has identified the moment and the mechanism, and who has ensured that the court has the parliamentary support to use them. It does not hold. She must have known, even as she drove it through, that it might not hold. Breaking a magnate's legal standing does not break his military capacity or his foreign connections. York in Ireland is still the greatest magnate in England, by blood and by the loyalties his name commands. Warwick in Calais has an experienced military garrison and a fortress that will not be taken from the Channel side by any force England can currently assemble against it. By the summer of 1460, they come back. The Yorkist return in the summer of 1460 has a momentum and a coherence that the attainders have done nothing to diminish. Warwick lands in Kent from Calais with a force that moves toward London with the confidence of men who have been planning this for months, who have the organisational capacity and the military experience to execute what they have planned. They are received in London with less resistance than the royal government would have wished. The city has its own calculations about which side it wants to be identified with, and those calculations have been shifting. The Yorkist army moves north toward the royal forces that have been assembling in the Midlands. At Northampton on the 10th of July 1460, the armies meet outside the town on meadows near the Nene River. The royal camp has been fortified with ditches and artillery, defences that should give the Lancastrian force inside it a significant advantage. But the defences fail, partly because of treachery from within the Lancastrian ranks, with one of the commanders switching sides during the engagement and allowing the Yorkist army to penetrate the defences at a point that should have held. The battle is over quickly. Henry VI is found inside his tent, sitting quietly while the fighting concludes around him, taken into the custody of the Yorkist commanders who treat him with the careful deference that his position demands. He is not harmed. He is never harmed in any of the engagements that will follow, because his captors understand what Margaret understands. An anointed king who is alive and in custody is manageable. An anointed king who has been killed is a martyr, and martyrs create problems that living prisoners do not. Margaret is not at Northampton. She has been in the Midlands and the North, organising and managing the military planning that Henry's incapacity and the limitations of the men around him make it necessary for her to manage herself. When the news of Henry's capture reaches her, she makes the calculation rapidly. She cannot fight her way to him with the forces currently at her disposal. She gathers her son, who is now 6 years old, and the supporters who can still be gathered, and she moves north. First toward Wales and then, crossing the border, into Scotland. Scotland, under the Queen Regent Mary of Guelders, governing for the young James III, is the only sanctuary immediately available and the only source of potential allies within reach. Mary is a woman of political intelligence and her own calculations, and she is prepared to receive Margaret and to discuss the situation. The Scottish court has its own reasons for wanting the English political situation to remain unstable, and a Lancastrian queen in exile, seeking support, is a piece that can be useful in those calculations. Margaret negotiates. She offers Berwick, the great border fortress that England has held and Scotland has long wanted, in exchange for military support and the security of a base on Scottish soil. It is a significant concession. The cession of English territory that she does not have the formal authority to give away, and she is aware of this. She gives it away anyway, because the alternative is to try to fight without any allies at all. And she has already decided that she will do whatever the situation requires. While Margaret is in Scotland, the ground in England shifts in a way that changes the nature of the conflict permanently and forces it onto terrain from which there is no longer a path back to the political accommodations of the previous decade. In October 1460, Richard of York, standing before the assembled Lords of Parliament in Westminster Hall, formally claims the throne of England for himself and his heirs. This is not the claim to influence that he has been making for 15 years, not the petition for a more appropriate role in the governance of the realm, not the appeal to the king to hear the counsel of his greatest magnate. This is the claim to the throne itself, based on his descent from Edward III through the female line of Lionel, Duke of Clarence. A descent that he argues gives him a stronger title than Henry VI's own, which runs from a different and arguably later branch of the same tree. The Lords of Parliament, who had not anticipated this, and who were not prepared for the consequences of either accepting or rejecting it outright, find a middle path in the Act of Accord, agreed in October 1460. Henry VI will remain king for his natural lifetime, but Richard of York and his heirs will succeed him, bypassing the claims of Henry's own son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. Henry, in one of the most poignant moments of his entire reign, agrees to this arrangement. Whether he fully understands what he is agreeing to, whether the gentleness of his nature that has always prevented him from fighting for his own position simply capitulates here as it has always capitulated, or whether he makes a deliberate choice in some calculation we cannot reconstruct. The Act of Accord is agreed with his consent, and his son's inheritance is formally, legally dissolved. The Act of Accord is, in its way, the most radical document of the entire conflict, because it acknowledges in writing what everyone has been dancing around for years: that the claim of the House of York to the throne is at least as strong as, and by some argument stronger than, the claim of the House of Lancaster. It also does something more personally significant for Margaret, though the document's impersonal legal language does not acknowledge the person it most directly affects. It erases her son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, 7 years old, is not consulted. He is simply written out of his birthright by a legal fiction agreed between his father, who cannot protect him, and his enemies, who choose not to. His mother is in Scotland. Nobody asks her either. Margaret does not accept this. She cannot accept it. To accept it would be to make meaningless everything she has done since 1453, every decision she has made, every relationship she has built, every sacrifice she has endured and will endure. Edward of Westminster is the Prince of Wales. He is the heir to the English throne by the most fundamental principles of hereditary monarchy. He is not going to become a subject of a Yorkist king because his father signed a document. She is in Scotland, building an army, and in December 1460 she moves it south. What happens at Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460 is one of the pivots of the Wars of the Roses and one of the moments around which the most myth has accumulated. Richard of York camped at Sandal Castle in Yorkshire, with a force that is, by the most reasonable estimates, significantly smaller than the Lancastrian army assembling outside, sallies out to fight in the open field rather than maintaining the defensive advantage of his position. The reasons for this decision are not recorded with any certainty and have been debated ever since. Perhaps he underestimated the size of the force against him. Perhaps he was provoked or deceived into a position that made a sortie seem necessary. Perhaps the chivalric conventions of the period made it impossible for a man of his rank to sit inside a castle while enemy forces roamed his lands. Whatever the reason, he fights, and he loses, and he dies in the fighting, along with his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland. The Earl of Salisbury, Warwick's father, is captured and executed afterward. The York leadership, the men who have been pressing the Yorkist cause for a decade, are in a single December afternoon substantially destroyed. York's head, the head of a man who claimed the throne of England, is mounted above the gate of the city of York with, according to the Yorkist chronicles that describe it, a paper crown placed upon it. The chronicles that make this claim are written by people with strong political interests in having Margaret appear as monstrous as possible, and the detail of the paper crown, so dramatically perfect, so symbolically loaded, has always to be held with some caution. Whether Margaret ordered it, whether she was present, whether she was near York at all on that day, the sources do not tell us clearly. What the detail has done, across 6 centuries of retelling, is attach itself to her reputation as the emblem of a cruelty she may or may not have commanded. This is how propaganda works. It finds the detail that confirms the story it wants to tell, and the detail outlives the propaganda. The paper crown is the accusation that defines her in the popular imagination for 6 centuries, not Towton, which she did not choose, but could not prevent. Not the negotiations at Angers, which were a diplomatic achievement of the First Order. Not the Second Battle of St. Albans, which she won. The paper crown, which she may not have ordered, and which no reliable source confirms she saw. History has a way of choosing its women's symbols for them, and the choice is rarely the women's most representative moment. The weeks after Wakefield represent the high water mark of the Lancastrian cause, and they have the quality of a great wave that reaches exactly as far as it is going to reach before the tide turns. Margaret's army, drawn from the northern counties and from Scotland and from Wales, moves south with a momentum that reflects the scale of what has just been accomplished. The Yorkist military leadership has been largely destroyed at Wakefield. The path to London appears open. The Lancastrian cause has not been in this strong a position since before St. Albans. In 1455, she wins the Second Battle of St. Albans on the 17th of February 1461. Warwick, who has been commanding the Yorkist force in Henry's absence, attempts to block the army with a position north of London that proves impossible to hold. The Lancastrian force, larger and more coherently led, attacks it and breaks it, and Warwick escapes the field with whatever of his force he can gather, leaving his artillery and many of his men behind. Among the people found on the battlefield after the fighting is Henry VI himself, who had been brought from London by the Yorkists and who is discovered sitting beneath an oak tree, attended by 2 loyal knights who had promised him they would not abandon him, and who have kept their word through the chaos of the battle around them. He has been singing hymns. He blesses the knights for their faithfulness. He blesses the men. Bring him to Margaret. He blesses, it seems, the day. The family is reunited in a field outside Salbans on a February morning in 1461, and there is a moment, brief and strange and genuinely touching, in which the woman who has been fighting for this man's crown for 15 years and the man who could never fight for it himself are together with their son, who is 7 years old and is being told that his parents are reunited and that the way is clear to London. For a few hours on that February morning, the Lancastrian dynasty seems to hold. The days between the battle and the approach to London are, by any reckoning, the closest Margaret ever comes to recovering what she has been fighting for. She has a functioning army. She has her son, 7 years old and healthy and entirely worthy of the name Prince of Wales. She has her husband, who is lucid and grateful and surrounded by the familiar faces of the Lancastrian court. She has a road clear of opposition for the first time in years. She sends for the lords in London and in the home counties to come to her. She executes orders. She is a queen with an army and the king and the prince at her side. And for a week in February 1461, the machinery of a restored Lancastrian government hums with something approaching the authority it once had. She moves toward London. The road is clear. She sends word ahead. The Queen and the King are coming. The city should open its gates to receive them. London closes its gates. This decision, made by the city's authorities in the days after St. Albans, is the hinge on which everything that follows turns. London is a trading city, and a trading city has a specific kind of political calculation to make in a situation like this one. The Northern Army moving toward it has a reputation for disorder, for the looting and destruction that armies drawn from regions distant from the city have always brought with them when they pass through the territories they cross. Reports have been coming into London from the north and the Midlands of the damage done by the Lancastrian force as it marched south. This is partly Yorkist propaganda, partly genuine, partly the inevitable result of an army moving fast through country it does not own. Whatever the proportion of truth and exaggeration, London believes it, or finds it convenient to believe it, and the city's aldermen and merchants make their calculation. The Lancastrian army will take what it finds, and London has a great deal worth taking. Margaret negotiates. She sends envoys. She sends letters. She promises that the city will be protected, that the merchants will be safe, that the army will be provisioned and paid without plundering. The negotiations continue for several days. The city continues to stall, to find reasons why it cannot open quite yet, why it needs more assurances, why the timing is not right. And while it stalls, Edward of York arrives from the west. Edward is 18 years old, the son of the Richard of York, who died at Wakefield, the inheritor of his father's claim and of the Yorkist cause. He is 6 feet 4 inches tall, with the physical presence that his father's line has always carried, and that has been amplified in him to something extraordinary. He is magnetic in the way that certain people are magnetic, the combination of physical scale and absolute confidence, and the intelligence to deploy both effectively. He has been in the West, gathering forces from the Mortimer estates and the Welsh March country, and he arrives in London with an army at his back and a claim to the throne that London, having shut its gates to Margaret, now has no particular reason not to consider. London opens its gates. Edward of York is proclaimed King Edward IV by his supporters in a ceremony that carries enough of the formal weight of legitimacy to be convincing. The Lords of Parliament who are in London participate, the citizens acclaim the proclamation. The symbolism is managed carefully. There are now, technically, 2 kings of England. The question of which one is going to hold the throne will be decided in a field. Edward moves north immediately. He moves with the speed and purpose that has characterized everything about his campaign so far. gathering forces as he goes, absorbing the momentum of a cause that has just found its charismatic leader after years of being managed by men who lacked the combination of ability and presence that the moment required. He is heading toward Yorkshire, toward the Lancastrian heartland, toward the army that Margaret has assembled, and that is moving to meet him. They meet at Towton, on a plateau south of the town, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March 1461. The morning is cold. There has been overnight snow, and there is more snow in the air, and a wind is blowing strongly from the southwest across the open plateau. A wind that will matter in the course of the battle in a way that nobody is fully anticipating yet. The armies face each other across the plateau. The Lancastrian force is larger, positioned on slightly higher ground, with the wind behind them. The Yorkist force is smaller, positioned downhill, with the wind in their faces. The battle begins with archery. The Yorkist archers release their arrows into the wind. The wind carries the arrows further than their range would normally allow, deeper into the Lancastrian ranks. The Lancastrian archers release their arrows. The wind kills the arrows' momentum and carries many of them short, so that they fall harmlessly in the ground before the Yorkist line. Seeing this, the Lancastrian commanders order an advance to close the gap, to bring the battle from archery to hand where the wind cannot help the enemy. The Lancastrian army moves down the slope, abandoning the defensive advantage of the high ground. What follows is the longest and bloodiest single day of fighting in English history. The numbers involved are the largest of any medieval English engagement. Estimates vary between the sources, as they always do for medieval battles, where counting the dead was not a priority, but the figures that most historians find credible put the dead in the tens of thousands, with the Lancastrian losses vastly exceeding the Yorkist because of what happens when the line finally breaks. The line breaks in the late afternoon, when a Lancastrian reserve arrives from the east and joins the Yorkist force, tipping the balance at the moment when both sides are exhausted and the outcome is on a knife edge. The Lancastrian formation collapses. The retreat turns into a rout, and the rout turns into a pursuit that runs for miles across the plateau and down into the valleys on either side, with men cut down in fields and in the Cockbeck River and in the villages, the killing continuing long after dark. Among the dead are names that fill the peerage list of England, some of the most distinguished titles in the kingdom, representing families that have been Lancastrian for 2 or 3 generations and that will not recover from this day. The Lancastrian cause as a military proposition, as a force capable of putting an army in the field that can defeat the Yorkist alternative, has been destroyed. The sun goes down on Towton, and Edward IV is King of England. And the only question is how long it will take the remaining Lancastrians to accept it. Margaret and Henry are at York, waiting. The news takes time to travel, and when it arrives in the form of a catastrophe large enough that it takes time even to comprehend its extent. They ride north immediately, with their son and the few loyal supporters who are still with them, and they do not stop until Scotland is on the other side of the border behind them. Behind them, England reorganises. Edward IV returns to London. He is crowned at Westminster in June 1461, with the ceremony that makes a king. New Acts of Attainder are issued, this time against the Lancastrians. Margaret of Anjou, listed among the attainted, finds her legal standing in England dissolved, her properties confiscated, her status as queen of anything reduced to a claim that nobody in England is currently in a position to enforce. Behind her in England, The world is reorganizing with a speed and a thoroughness that reflects how complete the Yorkist victory has been. The attainders that Edward IV issues in the weeks after Towton are extensive. They strip the Lancastrian nobility of their titles and their lands and their legal standing, transferring the territorial wealth of a generation of Lancastrian loyalty into the hands of the Yorkist allies who have fought for the cause and earned their rewards. The estates of the Percy family in Yorkshire, the Courtenay lands in the West Country, the northern holdings of the Cliffords, the Welsh territories of the Lancastrian gentry, all of this is redistributed in the months after Towton. The material rewriting of the political landscape that consolidates a victory in the only way that actually lasts. People whose fortunes are now tied to the Yorkist settlement have a powerful material reason to keep it stable. She rides north, and she does not look back. But she does not stop, and she does not give up. And this is the most important fact about what happens at Towton. It is not the end. For most people in her position, it would be the end. For Margaret of Anjou, it is the beginning of the next phase of a fight she has not yet decided to stop. The Scotland she rides into in the spring of 1461 is not the same Scotland that offered her sanctuary in 1460, and the difference matters. Mary of Guelders, who governed Scotland as regent for the young James III, and who had been the pragmatic and intelligent interlocutor in Margaret's previous negotiations, dies in December 1463, and the Scottish regency that follows is less stable, less consistent in its purposes, and less predictably useful to the Lancastrian cause. What Scotland provides in these first years of exile is a border and a distance. A place that Edward IV cannot easily reach, and from which Margaret can still communicate with whatever remains of the Lancastrian network inside England. It is not enough. It is almost enough, and the difference between almost enough and enough is the difference between a cause that continues and one that collapses. The first weeks in Scotland are disorienting in the manner of all sudden arrivals in unfamiliar circumstances, even for someone as practiced at absorbing unfamiliar circumstances as she is. The Scottish court is competent and reasonably well organised by the standards of a small northern kingdom that has always had to manage with less than its southern neighbour. But it is not the French court, and it is not England, and the people in it, courteous as they are managing her presence with the pragmatic calculation of hosts who have taken in a guest whose situation is considerably more complicated than they entirely expected. She presents herself to Mary of Guelders and to the Scottish court with the composure that she always presents to every court, the composure that is both genuine, because her character produces it naturally, and strategic, because a queen who arrives in disarray loses the argument her composure was always making. She is the Queen of England, and she is in Scotland, and she is asking for help. And she asks with the dignity that her claim and her character both require. She is there for more than 2 years, moving between Scottish border fortresses and the cold grey residences that Scottish hospitality can provide, working with the resources and the patience she has been practicing her entire life. She negotiates with the Scottish Regency for military support. She writes letters to the French court, to the Burgundian court, to anyone in Europe who might calculate that a Lancastrian restoration would serve their interests. She keeps the correspondence networks alive inside England by the sheer persistence of the communication, sending messengers through and around the Yorkist surveillance of the borders, maintaining the thread of connection to the people inside England who have not yet transferred their loyalties. All of this requires money she barely has, and time she uses with perfect economy, and the kind of stubborn refusal to admit that the effort is futile that has been the most consistent quality of her character since she arrived in England at 15. The situation is not comfortable, and nothing pretends otherwise. She is a queen in exile, with a child and a reduced court, and a husband who is present in his quiet, devotional way, but who is not a source of practical strength. In a foreign country whose interest in her situation is instrumental rather than principled, where the climate is cold and the people around her are doing their best, but their best is not quite enough. Henry is with her for part of this period, and then he is not. By 1463 or 1464, he has made his way back into England by some combination of choice and circumstance, moving through the northern counties with a handful of loyal companions, relying on the hospitality of Lancastrian families in Lancashire and Yorkshire for refuge, appearing here and there in the scattered record as a fugitive figure who is still technically King of England and practically a wanderer in his own former kingdom. There is something unbearable about this picture if you allow yourself to look at it directly. The gentle, pious man moving from safe house to safe house, saying his prayers, perhaps still singing his hymns, recognizing none of the reality of his situation, because the reality of his situation is not the kind of thing his mind can fully apprehend. He is captured in Lancashire in 1465, handed over to Edward IV's men, and taken to London and installed in the Tower. He is treated, by all accounts, with the basic decency that his status demands, given rooms, given attendance, given the chapel time that is the irreducible requirement of his spiritual life. He is not cruelly treated, but he is a prisoner. And his imprisonment is one of the clearest signals possible about the permanence of the Yorkist settlement. Scotland teaches her something that she will carry into the French years. The quality of endurance that comes not from certainty, but from the refusal to let uncertainty become paralysis. The border country around Carlisle and Berwick, the Greystone and the cold wind, and the wide views over moorland to the Cheviots in one direction and the Forth estuary in another. The world of the Scottish court with its different politics, and its different language, and its different sense of what the English crown means and how much it matters. All of this teaches her to be comfortable with displacement, to operate in conditions of reduced certainty without losing the thread of what she is doing or why. She will need this quality for the rest of her life. Margaret takes her son from Scotland to France, and France is where she will spend the longest portion of her exile. She arrives in Normandy and makes her way to the court of Louis XI, who has been King of France since 1461 and who possesses the most distinctive political intelligence in the Europe of his generation. Louis XI is known to posterity by the nickname that his contemporaries gave him, the Spider King. Sitting at the centre of a web of intelligence and manipulation and double-dealing and patient calculation that gradually, over the course of his long reign, draws in almost everything around it. He is the opposite of everything that the chivalric ideals of his century celebrated, small and unglamorous, and entirely uninterested in the theatrical performance of kingship that the courts of his age produced as a form of propaganda, preferring instead the work of intelligence gathering and diplomatic manoeuvring, and the careful identification of exactly which lever to press, in exactly which situation, to achieve exactly the outcome he has calculated is to his advantage. He is also, for Margaret's purposes, the most important political figure in Western Europe, because France is the only power with the resources and the proximity to make a difference to her situation, and Louis is France. Louis receives her, hears her case, evaluates her situation with his characteristically thorough and unsentimental intelligence, and offers what the situation warrants in his calculation, not a great deal. He will give her a base, an income that is technically adequate, but practically thin, a position as a respected exile at the edges of the French court, the kind of welcome that costs something, but not very much, and that keeps the Lancastrian option alive in case it ever becomes useful. He will not commit French military resources to her cause at this stage. The relationship with Edward IV is one he is still calculating, and committing military resources to a deposed queen in the opening stages of his own reign is not a calculation that resolves in her favour. She accepts what he offers because she has no choice, and she makes her base in the region of Bar, in the Duchy of Lorraine, not far from the court of her father René, which is at least familiar terrain and at least a place where she is among people who know her. She arrives at the edges of her father's world and is received into it with the warmth that the situation and the man allow. René of Anjou is old now, by the standards of the age, past 60, and his court has contracted from the grandeur of her childhood years. The ambitions that once filled it have been discharged or abandoned or outlived by a man who found, in his 60s, that what the world offered him was not the kingdoms he had won and lost, but the creative work he had always done alongside the kingship, the painting, the verse writing in Provençal forms he has always loved, the illumination of manuscripts with hands beginning to stiffen but not yet stripped of their skill. He receives his daughter and his grandson with genuine warmth, because whatever else René is, he is a man who loves deeply and who does not become smaller in misfortune. The court at Angers and at Aix provides what it can: company, culture, warmth, the surrounding life of a court that is still, despite everything, a court, and not merely a household. Margaret's son Edward is growing up here among the remnants of the world that shaped his mother, learning the same mix of cultural seriousness and political instability that she learned, speaking French as easily as she does, becoming slowly and inevitably a product of exile. The exile years are long. They are not dramatically eventful from the outside, because the drama of her situation is mostly internal, mostly the sustained work of keeping a cause alive in the absence of the resources and the opportunities that would allow it to do more than survive. She writes letters. She maintains the correspondence networks that still connect her to the Lancastrian loyalists inside England, the men and women who are living as best they can under the Yorkist settlement, conforming to enough of it to avoid active persecution while keeping faith with the dynasty they served. She manages the small court that surrounds her with the attention to ceremony and dignity that she has always brought to courts. Because a court without dignity has already conceded something that cannot easily be recovered. She does not rage. She does not collapse. She endures, which is its own form of resistance, and she waits. Waiting is harder than fighting, and the sources give occasional glimpses of the cost. There are moments in the record where the edges of the composure show, where the distance between what she is and where she is becomes visible in a comment or a letter that carries slightly more than its careful surface. But she does not permit herself the luxury of a sustained breakdown, because there is no one who will do the work if she stops doing it, and the work is her son's future and her husband's crown and the dynasty's continuation. And none of these things will wait while she grieves. The Prince of Wales is growing up in exile, and the exile shapes him in ways that will eventually matter. He is 7 years old when they flee from Towton, 14 when the years of French exile are fully established, a young man being formed by the specific conditions of his situation, royal by birth and title, and the absolute conviction, with which his mother has always treated those facts, but without the kingdom that the title requires, without the court and the ceremony and the material reality of what being a Prince of Wales should mean. Sustained instead by the promise of return and the patient, determined pressure of a mother who has never permitted him to treat the loss as permanent. He speaks French fluently and English adequately. He is reportedly physically vigorous and martial in his inclinations, interested in warfare and in the chivalric codes that surround it with a seriousness that reflects both his age and his situation. If you are going to recover a throne, you will need to know how to fight for it. And the young Edward of Westminster understands this with a clarity that suggests he has been thinking about it for some time. His education is supervised as well as the resources allow, with tutors provided by the French court and by the resources of René's circle, men of learning and accomplishment, who give him the grounding in the literary and historical culture of his world that any prince of his period would require. He is described in the sources as handsome and spirited, with a tendency toward impatience and a confidence in his own judgments that sometimes tips into arrogance. The confidence of a young man who has been raised to believe in his own absolute importance and who has not yet had the experience of power against which that belief must be tested and adjusted. He is his mother's son and his grandfather's grandson, and both inheritances are visible in him. The cultural seriousness of René's court, the absolute determination of the woman who has raised him. Whether he would have been a good king had history allowed the question to be answered, is something we can speculate about, but not know. Court in exile maintains its forms with the same care for form that defines everything she does. There are ladies in waiting, officers of the household, the ceremonial rhythms of a court that observes the liturgical calendar and the social customs of its rank, because these things matter not merely as aesthetics, but as assertions. A court that looks like a court is still a court, still a centre of legitimate authority, still a thing that the world is required to take seriously, even if the court of Europe is not currently doing so. Visitors come, Lancastrian exiles who have followed the Queen from England, men who have given up their lands and their positions rather than transfer their allegiance, diplomats and agents who are cultivating the Lancastrian connection for reasons of their own. Occasional French grandees who find the princess of a fallen dynasty a more interesting proposition than the routine traffic of the French court. For all of them, she is what she has always been. Gracious, informed, attentive, never quite allowing anyone to forget that the audience they are receiving is with a Queen of England. Henry VI, in the Tower, is alive and apparently in tolerable health by the standards of what tolerable health means for a man of his age and circumstances. He has his chapel and his books and his attendants. He is not mistreated in any way, the record reveals. But he is in the Tower, and he is there at Edward's pleasure, and the fact of his continued living is both a comfort and a complication. A comfort because while he lives the Lancastrian claim has its proper centre, its legitimate king, its source of authority from which everything else derives. A complication because while he lives, any attempt to recover the throne must be framed as his recovery and not as anyone else's. And he is not capable of framing anything. He is a figurehead whose existence is necessary and whose participation is not available. Margaret maintains him in her communications as the king, always the king, the rightful occupant of a throne that is being held unjustly, the person on whose behalf everything she does is being done. This is not purely strategic. She has maintained her commitment to him with a consistency that goes beyond what strategy alone would require. But strategy and loyalty here point in the same direction, and she does not distinguish between them. The intelligence she receives from England, through the correspondence network she has maintained with such persistence, tells her in the early and middle years of the 1460s what she already knows. The Yorkist settlement is consolidating. Edward IV is governing with sufficient competence to prevent the immediate return of the instability that allowed the Lancastrian cause to survive the 1450s. There are discontents, as there always are under any settlement. But the discontents are not yet organised into anything that the Lancastrian cause can use. The moment is not here. She waits. The texture of exile is something that the political narrative of these years tends to pass over quickly, because the political narrative is interested in events, and exile is the absence of events, the long grey space between the things that happen. But Margaret's exile is worth pausing inside for a moment, because it is where she spends the longest continuous portion of her adult life, and because the person who comes out of it, who makes the decisions of 1470 and 1471 with the clarity and the nerve they require, is the person that exile made. The Loire Valley that she makes her base in during the late 1460s is a landscape that the traveller from the north finds almost startlingly gentle, a country of wide flat-bottomed valleys cut by slow rivers, of pale limestone bluffs that rise from the meadows and catch the afternoon light and hold it in a way that the darker stone of the north does not. The chateaux that line the riverbanks are built from this stone, the tuffeau that comes out of the ground, cream-coloured and warm and weathers over centuries into something that seems to glow in certain lights, and the towns are built from it too, and the churches, so that the whole valley has a visual consistency and a warmth that the northern exile finds both comforting and quietly painful, because it is beautiful and it is not England. And England is the place that all of her calculations have been oriented toward since the day she left it. The court that surrounds her in these years is small and reduced and loyal, as stripped-down courts always are, having shed their worldly utility and found loyalty to something more personal and more essential. The people who have followed her into exile have done so in full knowledge of what they are giving up. The English lands and offices and social positions that attainder has stripped from them, the domestic lives they might have had, the accommodation with a Yorkist reality that would have allowed them to remain in their own country. They are in France because they chose to be, and the choice defines something about them that the years of reduced circumstances have not changed. They are devoted to her with the devotion that can only be produced by the combination of genuine admiration and genuine sacrifice. The loyalty of people who have put everything they had on the same table, she has put everything on, and who are bound to her by the weight of that common wager. She manages them with the attentiveness she has given to people who matter to her, aware of their needs and their moods, attentive to the small recognitions and the marks of consideration that allow people living in difficult circumstances to feel that they are seen and valued. She has never been a queen who required the formal distance that some monarchs maintain between themselves and their household. She prefers the more direct engagement, the personal word and the personal attention, and in the exile years this quality deepens, because the household is small enough that the personal is not a luxury, but a necessity. These people are what she has. She values them accordingly. The religious life of the household is organised with care. She attends Mass every morning, and the chaplains who have come with her maintain the offices of the day in the small chapel of whatever residence they are using, so that the rhythms of the liturgical year and the liturgical day provide a structure to the weeks that the absence of political work might otherwise leave structureless. Her faith is genuine, not in the absorbing, all-consuming way of Henry, for whom piety was the primary lens through which all of experience was organized, but in the grounded, habitual, personally meaningful way of a woman, for whom the Church's forms have always been part of what holds the world together. In exile, those forms hold more weight than they did when the world was full of urgent practical demands. They are the architecture of a day that might otherwise have no architecture, Sue reads in these years, with the thoroughness that the availability of René's collections allows. The Chateau of Anjou and the Loire contain libraries assembled across several generations of people who took books seriously, and she moves through them with attention, history and theology, and the romance literature that the 15th century produced in such abundance. The prose Arthurian cycles and the chivalric romances that narrate the world of courts and quests and honourable failure and endurance. She reads Christine de Pisan's work again. The arguments about women and governance and the dignity of female intelligence that Christine made in the early decades of the century. And perhaps she finds in them a form of company that the particular quality of her situation makes valuable. She is, in the Loire Valley in the 1460s, among the most politically experienced women in Europe, and there is almost nowhere to put that experience. And the reading is one of the places she puts it. Louis XI is a presence throughout these years that she never quite manages to read to her satisfaction, which is itself a measure of his quality, because Margaret of Anjou is very good at reading people, and almost nobody escapes her reading. He is slight and watchful and dressed, by preference, in ways that have struck every courtier and every diplomat who encounters him as notably plain, almost aggressively simple. A man who has decided that the theatrical performance of royalty is a game he does not need to play because his actual power is sufficient, and the performance would only signal the anxiety of someone who was not sure their power was sufficient. He wears old hats and familiar clothes, and rides modest horses, and treats the elaborate ceremonial that other courts of his period consider essential with a contempt that is itself a performance of someone who has risen above performance. He is formidably intelligent, and he is not kind, not in any sense that would count as kindness in the world he is navigating. He is capable of genuine warmth toward the few people he actually likes, which is a limited number, but the warmth is always entangled with the calculation, and you can never be sure, in any given moment, whether what he is showing you is the warmth or the calculation wearing the warmth's face. He is not hostile to Margaret's cause. He is not supportive of it either. He regards it as he regards everything, as a variable in a calculation that is always changing its weights as the circumstances change. When her cause is useful, when keeping the Lancastrian option alive serves his purposes with England or with Burgundy or with the other players on his complicated board, he sustains it. When her cause is not immediately useful, he reduces it to the minimum that courtesy and the residual value of the connection require. He is a patron of exactly the calculating kind that makes being a client of his simultaneously essential and exhausting. And she has been his client for a decade, when the conversations at Angers in 1470 produced the thing she has been waiting for. The crack in the Yorkist settlement that will eventually give Margaret her opening is not one she creates. It forms between Edward IV and the man most responsible for his throne, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick is, in the early years of Edward's reign, the dominant political figure beside the king, the man who organised the Yorkist alliances and the military campaigns and the crucial defection that let the Yorkist forces through at Northampton, who has more invested in the Yorkist cause than anyone alive, apart from the king himself. He is also a man of formidable ambition, strong opinions, and a deep conviction that the services he has rendered entitle him to an influence over the king's decisions that the king is, as the years proceed. Increasingly disinclined to concede, the breaking point between them is a marriage. In 1464, Edward IV secretly marries Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of a Lancastrian knight, a woman of English gentry rather than royal blood, without consulting Warwick or anyone else of significance in the council. Warwick discovers the marriage, as everyone discovers it, after the fact, when it is too late to prevent it, and the discovery is humiliating in ways that go beyond the personal. He has been conducting diplomatic negotiations in France for a royal French marriage that he believes will consolidate the Yorkist position and extend Edward's alliances on the continent. The secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville makes him look like a fool, which Warwick is not and cannot bear to appear to be. The rift that opens between them over the Woodville marriage does not close. It widens, fed by the steady expansion of Woodville influence over patronage and appointments, by the Queen's relatives filling positions that the great magnates regard as their natural territory, by the compound of personal humiliation and political exclusion that Warwick accumulates over the following years. The Woodville family's rise is rapid and visible in ways that Warwick cannot ignore and cannot accommodate. Elizabeth's father, Richard Woodville, is made Earl Rivers. Her brother Anthony becomes among the most celebrated tournament knights in England, the embodiment of a chivalric culture that the Woodvilles wear with the slightly effortful elegance of a family that has recently acquired the clothes. Her son from her first marriage, Thomas Grey, is married to the Exeter heiress. Several of her sisters are married off to great lords, matching the Woodvilles by marriage into the highest tier of the English nobility in a generation. Warwick watches all of this with the precise, cataloguing attention of a man who understands very well what it means and who calculates, as he calculates everything, what the appropriate response is. The appropriate response is, eventually, war. By 1469, Warwick is in open rebellion, allying with Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, who has his own reasons to be dissatisfied with the Woodville dominance of the court. By 1470, the situation has deteriorated to the point where Warwick and Clarence have fled England and are in France, seeking resources and alliances for a return. Louis XI, alert as always to the possibilities of others' quarrels, sees the move that the situation makes available, and he acts as the broker for what is, without question, the most extraordinary diplomatic reversal of the 15th century. He brings together in his palace at Angers, in the autumn of 1470, the woman who has been fighting the Yorkist cause for a decade and the man who made the Yorkist cause possible. He brings together Margaret of Anjou and Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the months before the Angers meeting, the months in which Louis is moving the pieces into position, and Warwick is in France, and the possibility of the alliance is becoming visible on the horizon, are months of specific quality for Margaret. She knows something is building. She has been watching the intelligence coming in from England, from France, from the diplomatic networks, and the intelligence is telling her that Warwick's position has deteriorated to the point where he needs something she has, which is the Lancastrian legitimacy that only the name of Henry VI and his heir can provide, and that Louis is willing to broker the arrangement if she is willing to make it. She is willing, she has always been willing to make any arrangement that moves the project forward. The question is the price and the terms, and she will not set those until she is sitting in the room. The meeting at Angers in September 1470 is described in the sources with a specificity unusual for this period, because the specificity serves a political purpose. It demonstrates to those watching and to posterity the nature of the power relationship between the two parties. Warwick kneels before Margaret. He kneels for, the sources say, 15 minutes. Sometimes the figure given is quarter of an hour, during which Margaret says nothing, and he remains on his knee, and the court around him watches. What she is doing in those 15 minutes is making absolutely clear, in the most visible and visible language available to the ceremonial culture of her world, who has the better claim to apology and to deference. Warwick made Edward king. He did it knowingly and willingly, as a calculation of political interest. He did it against her. The 15 minutes of kneeling is the price she exacts before she will discuss any arrangement, and everyone in the room understands exactly what the price represents. What does Margaret think during those 15 minutes? The sources give us the scene from the outside: the man on his knee, the woman not speaking, the court watching. What is happening inside the woman, who is not speaking, is not recorded and cannot be recovered with any certainty. But we can construct something of it from what we know of her. She is 40 years old, or near enough. She has been fighting for her son's birthright since the boy was a few weeks old. The man kneeling before her is the man who made that fight necessary, who organised the Yorkist cause and executed its victories and drove her out of England. She has spent 9 years in exile because of what this man and his allies chose to do. She is not going to let him forget it in a hurry. The 15 minutes is not theatrical cruelty, it is the settling of an account. The 15 minutes of kneeling will be the detail that everyone remembers, and it will be remembered for the right reasons, because in the ceremonial language of the 15th century, which is a language of extraordinary precision and density, this particular gesture is among the most explicit statements of subordination available. Lords do not kneel before queens for 15 minutes in public. They kneel briefly, they are raised, the ceremony acknowledges the hierarchy and then permits the participants to move beyond it into the ordinary conduct of business. When the kneeling extends to 15 minutes, with the court watching and the queen silent and the kneeling man maintaining his position without being invited to rise, the statement being made is not ceremonial, but political. Not a gesture of formal courtesy, but a declaration of where the balance of right between these two people actually lies. Warwick made Edward IV. He did it in full knowledge that it destroyed the woman now watching him kneel. He is kneeling for it, and everyone in the room understands exactly why. She does discuss an arrangement. She does not have the luxury of refusing to, because the situation she has been enduring for 9 years requires any ally who might actually make a difference. And Warwick, for all the history between them, is the most powerful man in English politics outside the king himself, with the connections and the military experience and the name that commands followings. The arrangement is sealed by what dynastic arrangements are always sealed by: a marriage. Anne Neville, Warwick's younger daughter, will marry Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. The match is negotiated with care. Margaret insists that the marriage not be consummated until Warwick has actually delivered England, until Henry is restored and the situation is stable enough for her to trust that the arrangement will hold. This insistence is not merely tactical caution. It is the posture of a woman who has been betrayed by enough political arrangements to know that delivery must precede reward, and who will not put her son into a marriage that may be used against him if the situation changes. She watches him leave from the French coast, and she does not say what she is thinking, or if she says it, the sources do not preserve what she says. What she must be thinking, among everything else she is thinking, is that this is the most consequential gamble of her life, larger even than Towton, in the sense that Towton was a catastrophe that overtook her, whereas this is a gamble she has chosen to make with open eyes. She is placing the future of her cause in the hands of the man who was most responsible for destroying it, in a transaction brokered by a king who has made clear that his support is instrumental and conditional. And the only guarantee she has of Warwick's commitment is the betrothal of her son to his daughter, which is a human guarantee and therefore fallible, and the calculation of his own self-interest, which she trusts somewhat more. She watches him leave, and she turns back to France, and she waits for the news that will tell her whether the gamble has paid. The waiting that follows Warwick's departure is a different quality of waiting from the waiting she has been doing for the past 9 years. That waiting had the quality of endurance, of someone holding a position under sustained pressure without any clear prospect of relief. This waiting has the quality of suspense, of someone who has made a bet and is watching the outcome determine itself in real time. She has staked everything on the calculation that Warwick's self-interest is durable enough to carry him through to the delivery he has promised, and that Louis's investment in the arrangement is large enough to prevent the defections and the reversals that would unravel it. She follows the intelligence coming in from England with an attention that goes beyond her usual thoroughness. She is reading dispatches. She is writing letters. She is tracking the progress of an operation that depends at every stage on people performing their roles correctly. The intelligence tells her, in the weeks after Warwick's landing, that the operation is working. Edward IV has been caught without sufficient forces to meet the challenge. The defections are happening on the scale she and Warwick calculated, because Warwick's reputation and his network are intact despite everything, and people who have been nursing dissatisfactions with the Woodville court are finding it very easy to believe that the man who made Edward IV can unmake him. She reads this intelligence with the concentration of someone who is making sure she is reading it correctly, who is not permitting herself the relief of accepting good news uncritically, because the history of the past decade has taught her that good news has a way of curdling at the worst possible moment. Warwick delivers. He sails for England with Clarence, and a force assembled from French resources and his own connections, and the landing in September 1470 sets off a collapse of Yorkist authority that is astonishing in its speed. Edward IV has not been anticipating the scale of the defection. His own supporters in the north rise for Warwick. His brother Clarence is already committed to the other side, and the forces he can gather prove insufficient to meet the challenge. Edward IV flees England in September 1470, taking ship from the Norfolk coast with his brother Richard and a small group of loyal followers, making for the Burgundian court, where his sister Margaret has been Duchess since her marriage to Charles of Burgundy in 1468. He leaves England, and Henry VI is taken from the Tower and restored to his throne in what posterity calls the readeption, the reattainment of the crown by its rightful holder. Henry is made king again in October 1470, and the men around him do their best to arrange his court and his governance in forms that will hold. He is 50 years old, and he has spent 5 years in the Tower, and he is not well, in the ways that 5 years in the Tower does not leave you well. Though the record is imprecise about what his condition specifically entails, he is gentle and pious and present in his particular way, and the men who are governing in his name, principally Warwick, do their best to build the administrative machinery that a restored regime requires. It is, in practice, Warwick's government with Henry as its figure, and everyone understands this, though nobody says it in terms that would require acknowledgement. The English nobility recalibrates. This is what the English nobility always does in these moments. It reads the room, assesses the probability that the current arrangement will prove durable, calculates the cost of different commitments, and makes whatever accommodation the calculation recommends. Some of the great families that have been navigating Yorkist England through the 1460s now rediscover their Lancastrian sympathies with a speed that tells you something about the depth those sympathies had attained. Others maintain a watchful neutrality, waiting to see whether the readaptation is something that can be counted on before they commit to supporting it. Very few people in October 1470 are willing to stake everything on the permanence of a settlement that has come about through the defection of one great magnate from the king he made, and that rests, as everyone can see, on the continued cooperation of a man whose relationship with Margaret of Anjou is recent, transactional, and based on no history of trust. Margaret is in France for all of this, and the correspondence she is conducting in these months is among the densest and most intensive of her life, because she is managing from a distance the political operation that is simultaneously her best chance at everything she has been working toward and the most fragile arrangement she has ever tried to maintain. She is communicating with Warwick about the timetable of her crossing. She is communicating with the Lancastrian lords who are now back in positions of influence in England about the preparations for her arrival. She is communicating with Louis about the resources she needs for the fleet. She is managing her son's preparation for the role he will play when they land. She is doing all of this while the weather on the Channel refuses to cooperate, and while the intelligence coming from England is telling her things that she is processing and assessing and acting on with the thorough, unhurried precision that intelligence has always demanded of her. She knows, or should know, that the longer she waits, the more fragile the arrangement becomes. Every week that she is not in England is a week in which Warwick is governing without her anchoring presence, without the legitimacy that the Queen and the Prince's actual arrival would provide, without the symbol of continuity and return that her presence represents. She understands this. The weather is genuinely preventing the crossing, and she is not manufacturing the delay, but the delay is costly, and she knows it is costly. And the knowledge adds to the weight she is already carrying. She does not cross until April. The weather in the Channel in the winter of 1470 and early spring of 1471 is actively hostile, the kind of winter that makes the crossing genuinely dangerous for a fleet that does not have the resources for large ships or experienced navigators. And the delays are real delays. Not the cowardice or the poor judgment that later Yorkist accounts will frame them as. Every week she waits in France, she knows is a week in which the restored Lancastrian regime is operating without the presence and the authority that only her arrival in England can provide. She knows this. She crosses as soon as the weather allows. She lands at Weymouth on the 14th of April, 1471. On the 14th of April, 1471, 3 hours' ride to the north, the Battle of Barnet is fought in the thick spring fog on the ridge above the town, and Warwick is killed. She does not know this yet when she comes ashore. She learns it within hours or within a day, from riders who are bringing the news south with the urgency that news of this magnitude requires. Edward IV has returned from Burgundy with men and money supplied by his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, has landed in Yorkshire, has gathered forces rapidly and moved south through England with a speed that reflects both his military ability and the fundamental shakiness of the readaptation's hold on the country. At Barnet, in the fog, he has met Warwick's army and defeated it, and Warwick has been found dead on the field after the rout and stripped of his armour and identified, and his body displayed. Because displaying the body is how you prove to the world that the thing the body represented is finished. Margaret learns all of this on the shore at Weymouth, or in whatever town she has reached by the time the riders find her. And the question she faces is the starkest she has faced since Towton. She is in England with her son and a small force that has crossed with them from France. The most powerful military ally she had, the man who made the entire operation of the past 8 months possible, is dead. Henry VI is in London, presumably back in the Tower or on his way there. Edward IV is marching south and east with an army that has just won a victory and has the confidence and momentum that a victory brings. She could re-embark. She could take her son back to France. Acknowledge that the situation is not recoverable on the current attempt. Preserve what can be preserved for another effort in another time. This is the calculation that rational self-preservation would recommend. She does not re-embark. She meets with the lords who have come with her from France, with the Lancastrian supporters who are gathering to her in the West Country, and she makes her decision. The west of England is Lancastrian territory. The country of the Courtenays and the Somersets and the Welsh Marcher families who have been loyal to the crown through the decade and who have resources still available if she can reach them and organise them. She will build an army from the west and march on Edward IV, who is coming from the east, and she will fight. Her son is 19 and is ready to fight. The cause is not finished, while the decision to continue has not been abandoned. She has made this choice at every previous moment when the alternative was available, and she makes it again now on the shore at Weymouth in April 1471, with the news of Barnet not yet cold. She moves northwest through the West Country. Gathering forces as she goes, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, the son of the Somerset who was killed at St. Albans, joins her with his forces and takes command of the military operation with an energy and a commitment that reflects his family's long loyalty to the cause. John Courtenay, Earl of Devon, brings the West Country retinues. Welsh forces are promised from across the border, where Jasper Tudor, the Lancastrian veteran who has been maintaining the Welsh cause through the long years, is raising men and moving to join her. The army that assembles is not the largest she has commanded, but it is real, and it is moving, and the momentum of movement has always been its own form of argument. The race to the Severn is the military movement that defines the last phase of Margaret's active campaign for the throne. And it is a race because the strategic logic of the situation dictates that it must be. The Welsh forces under Jasper Tudor, which would significantly strengthen her army, are on the wrong side of the Severn. To reach them and unite the two forces, she needs to cross the Severn at a point south enough to be manageable. And the bridge at Gloucester is the crossing she has identified. She moves with speed. Edward IV, recognizing the strategy, moves to prevent it. He drives his army hard to cut her off before she can make the crossing. A parallel march of extraordinary pace that pushes men and horses to the limit of what they can sustain. She reaches Gloucester and finds the gates closed against her. The town, calculating as all towns calculate in this situation, has decided that the Yorkist side is the side it prefers to be on, and it will not allow the Lancastrian army through the town to reach the bridge. She has no time to besiege it. Every hour at Gloucester is an hour that Edward's army is drawing closer. She turns north, toward Tewkesbury, where there is another crossing point, and she drives the army on. The men have been marching hard for days in warm spring weather, without adequate rest or food, and they are exhausted in ways that will matter when the fighting begins. But she drives them on, because the alternative to reaching Tewkesbury before Edward IV is to be caught on an open road without the river at their back and without Jasper's forces beside them. They reach Tewkesbury on the 3rd of May and take up position in the fields south of the town, between the town and the river, behind hedges and ditches and the local geography that Somerset's military eye has selected for its defensive possibilities. They have a night to rest. Edward's army comes up the following morning, the 4th of May, and the battle begins. Tewkesbury is a sharp engagement, compressed into a short time, and it goes wrong for the Lancastrians with the specific kind of wrong that comes from making a decision that has tactical logic but strategic consequences that cannot be recovered from. Somerset, commanding on the left, sees an opportunity to attack the Yorkist right in a position that seems exposed and launches an assault against it. The assault is repulsed, partly because Gloucester has been positioned with exactly the Lancastrian left in mind and brings his forces across to meet Somerset's attack, and Somerset, finding his assault reversed, retreats toward his own lines. The retreat breaks the formation, which is already under pressure from the centre, and what begins as a tactical withdrawal becomes a collapse that the other Lancastrian commanders cannot prevent. The Yorkist forces advance across the ground that the Lancastrian formation has given up, and the battle that was intended to decide the succession resolves in an afternoon of close, brutal fighting in the fields and the hedgerows and the ditches of the Tewkesbury meadows, with the Lancastrian army breaking and running, and the Yorkist pursuit coming after them into the town, into the Abbey churchyard, along the river bank. Edward, Prince of Wales, is killed. He is 19 years old. He has been waiting his whole conscious life for this, for the battle that would recover what the dynasty had lost before he was old enough to know it, and he dies in it, in the fields outside a Gloucestershire market town, in May 1471. How exactly he dies, the sources dispute with the partisan detail that surrounds every sensitive fact in this period. Some say he fell fighting, some say he was killed after capture, and some of those accounts name Edward IV or his brothers or some combination of them as the killers, and the accounts name this with varying degrees of conviction and some degree of motivation. We cannot resolve it with certainty. He died at Tewkesbury on the 4th of May, and he was 19, and he was the last of the direct male line of Lancaster. And his death is the fact that makes everything after it different in kind from anything that came before. Margaret is nearby when the battle ends. She is not on the field. She has been positioned behind the lines, positioned as commanders always position their most irreplaceable people when the fighting is engaged. She learns what has happened as commanders' dependents always learn it. From the shape of the men coming back, from the direction they are coming from the sounds that have gone quiet in the wrong way, from the faces, the Lancastrian army has been destroyed. Her son is dead. She is in England. And Edward IV is here, and there is nowhere to go. What happens in the hours and days after Tewkesbury is not fully recorded. The practical details where she went, who was with her, what route she took, survive only in fragments. What is clear is that she moves through a landscape that is littered with the evidence of everything she has just lost. The dead of the battle in the fields, the Abbey of Tewkesbury with its refugees sheltering within its walls, the countryside of a kingdom that has, in a single afternoon, finally closed around the Yorkist settlement. She is a woman of 41 in a country that no longer has a place for her, surrounded by the wreckage of an effort that has consumed the entirety of her adult life. She is found. The sources differ on the detail of whether she surrendered or was captured, and the distinction perhaps matters less than the fact She is in Yorkist hands within days of Tewkesbury, brought before Edward IV and taken to London. She is taken to the Tower, 17 days after Tewkesbury. On the night of the 21st of May 1471, Henry VI dies in the Tower of London. The official account, put out by the Yorkist government, is that he died of melancholy, of pure displeasure and sorrow at what had happened in the world. A man whose gentle and fragile constitution was simply unable to sustain the news of everything that had gone wrong. This account is not believed at the time by the people most likely to know what the truth is, and it is not believed now by historians who have examined what the evidence actually allows. Henry is too convenient dead. He is the figure around whom any future Lancastrian effort would have to organise, the legitimate king whose very existence is an argument against the Yorkist settlement. Edward IV does not have a convincing reason to keep him alive, and he has a very clear reason to do otherwise. The contemporary Lancastrian chroniclers say he was murdered, and while their accounts must be read with their political commitments in mind, they are saying what their information leads them to say, and their information is closer to the event than anything we can access now. There is no record of what Margaret does when she learns that Henry is dead. The sources do not tell us this, any more than they tell us how she learns it or when. What they give us is the sequence of events and their dates, and from those dates we can construct the timeline, but not the experience of the person living inside the timeline. We know she is in the Tower. We know he dies on the 21st. We know she spends the next 4 years in custody. That is what the record contains. What happens in the hours between learning and continuing? What form the first hours of a grief that has this particular completeness takes in a woman who has never publicly permitted herself to collapse, is not in the record, and will not be. What she knows, whenever she learns it, is this: her husband of 26 years is dead, her son is dead. The dynasty for whose continuation she has spent her adult life fighting is ended in the direct male line. Her own legal status in England is that of a traitor and a prisoner, and she is in the Tower. The Tower in which she sits is a building she knows, from the outside, as the place her enemies kept her husband for 5 years, and from the inside, now, as the place that holds her too. Its walls are old and cold and indifferent to the specific nature of the suffering they contain. They have contained the suffering of the great for centuries, and they will contain it for centuries more. She sits in the Tower in May 1471, and she is 41 years old, and she is completely alone in the way that only people who have organised their entire lives around a purpose, and had that purpose taken from them, can be completely alone. This is the completeness of loss that no single summary can quite make real. It has to be felt in its accumulation, not one thing at once, not even several things at once, but everything at once. Arrived at after a decade of fighting that was precisely this full-length effort to prevent everything arriving at once. Her husband of 26 years is gone. Her son is gone. The dynasty is ended in the direct male line. Her legal status in England is traitor and prisoner, and the world outside the Tower walls is reorganising itself, as if the loss has already been processed, as if what she is carrying is simply the ordinary weight of ordinary defeat, when it is nothing of the kind. She does not write about this period in the sources that survive. She may have written, and those writings have not survived. Or she may have found that there was nothing that writing could address in the immediate aftermath of the Tower. She is in custody, she has lost everyone she was fighting for, and the world has taken the shape that she spent 30 years refusing to allow it to take. The paper is in the hands of the people who won, and they will write the record. And the record they write will not be charitable. The captivity that begins after Tewkesbury and the Tower in May 1471 is different in character from any of the other forms of constraint and difficulty that Margaret has previously endured, and the difference is this. It is the first situation in her adult life in which there is nothing she can do. In Scotland and in France, and during the years of building the Lancastrian coalition, and during the years of fighting and of exile and of waiting, there was always something she was doing. Always a plan she was working on, or a letter she was writing, or a relationship she was building, or an argument she was making to someone who needed to be convinced. Action of some kind was always available. The Tower years are the first years in which there is no available action, in which the thing she has been fighting for is gone in a completeness that makes the concept of strategy meaningless, in which the only thing the world is asking of her is that she exist quietly in the room she has been given and not cause any trouble. She is given, in these rooms, the provisions appropriate to her rank, a household of attendants, meals of adequate quality, access to a chapel and to books, the visits of physicians when she is unwell, the visits of occasional English lords who have been assigned custodial responsibility for her person. She is not mistreated. Edward IV is scrupulous about this, as any king must be who is managing his standing with the courts of Europe. The former Queen of England, living in squalid conditions, would be a topic of conversation and criticism that he does not need, and the former Queen of England, living in adequate comfort, is evidence that he is a civilized and generous victor, which is a position he very much wants to occupy. She has time now in quantities she has never had before. The days are long in the Tower years, long in the way that the days of people with too much time and too little to use it on are long, with the specific quality of length that is different from the length of days that are full and busy and demanding. She fills the time with the resources available, the books, the prayers, the correspondence with the small number of people who are still in contact, the management of her household, the conversations with her attendants that are the small coinage of a social life, reduced to its most immediate and most personal. She is, the sources suggest, in the glimpses they provide, not broken by this. She is reduced in the ways that the circumstances inevitably reduce anyone, but she is not destroyed, not turned into someone unrecognizable from the person she has been. She is still herself, attentive, composed, dignified in the mode that has always been both an expression of her character and an argument about her status. The England outside her windows is becoming, in these years, a country reconciled to Yorkist rule in the practical ways that countries reconcile themselves to whoever is governing them when the governing is adequate and the violence has stopped. Edward IV, in the 1470s, is governing with the competence that his natural political intelligence makes available to him when the external threat is removed and the internal opposition is suppressed. The economy is recovering from the disruptions of the previous decades. The court is splendid, because Edward IV understands, as well as Margaret always did, that a court that looks like a court makes an argument about legitimate authority. The great magnates are being managed with the patronage and the calculated balancing of interests that the Council of Henry VI never quite achieved. England is, in the 1470s, a country at peace and under adequate government, and the Lancastrian cause, which depended on the failures of Yorkist governance for its political oxygen, has no oxygen. Whether she thinks about this, whether she sits in her rooms in the Tower and in the various residences where she is kept, and traces the logic of how the world came to look the way it looks, whether she second-guesses any of the decisions she made or the ones she was unable to make because the circumstances did not permit them, Whether she allows herself any of the luxury of retrospect, the sources do not tell us. They tend to show us her exterior, the composed and dignified surface that she has always maintained, and the interior is her own. But the interior of a woman who has experienced what she has experienced, who has lost what she has lost, who is sitting now in the quiet rooms of a captivity that has no foreseeable end and no purpose except the management of a political problem that has solved itself, must have contained something, some form of processing that we cannot access, but cannot pretend, is not there. She is, for much of this period, unwell, in ways that the sources describe imprecisely but consistently enough to be credible. The years of campaigning and exile and the physical privations of the events of 1471 have left their mark on a constitution that has been under sustained pressure since the early 1450s. And the Tower years are not physically easy ones. She has headaches, fevers, the accumulated minor complaints of a body that has been driven harder than bodies are designed to be driven for longer than they are designed to sustain it. The physicians come and apply their remedies, some of which are genuinely useful and some of which are not, and she recovers and is ill again and recovers again. In the irregular cycle of someone whose health is no longer robust, but whose will to continue is sufficient to keep the body going in the same direction as the will, Henry died in May 1471, and the grief of that, piled on the grief of Edward at Tewkesbury, is not a thing she could have put down quickly, or perhaps at all. She had known Henry for 26 years. She had understood, for much of that time, what he was and was not capable of, and had made her choices accordingly. And the choices had been enormous sacrifices that she had made for him and in his name without ever, as far as any evidence shows, resenting him for the incapacities that made the sacrifices necessary. She had loved him in the particular and complicated way that you love someone whose limitations you can see clearly and whose character you nonetheless find genuinely worthy of the love. He was not the king she needed. He was a good man in all the ways that goodness is possible, when power and position and the accidents of birth have placed a good man in a role his goodness cannot adequately fill. She had buried him, in whatever ceremony or absence of ceremony the Tower permitted, and the burial is one more thing she carries in the quiet rooms. The ransom that Louis XI pays for her release is in some respects the final transaction of her public life. The last time that her political value to the world is expressed in a monetary amount and exchanged for something useful. 50,000 crowns is a significant sum, and also, viewed from another angle, a small sum. The price at which the most politically significant woman in Western Europe over the past 2 decades can be removed from the English board and returned to France, where she will be harmless and manageable and available to Louis for whatever residual value the connection may provide. Edward accepts the offer because 50,000 crowns is 50,000 crowns, because keeping Margaret alive and in reasonable comfort costs money that the English treasury could use for other things, and because the former Queen of England, living in French exile as an old woman without means or allies, is not a threat to anyone. He accepts. The treaty is signed. The money changes hands. She crosses the Channel in the autumn of 1475, and England is behind her for the last time. She arrives in France as a woman of 45, who has been ransomed like a piece of property, which is what she is, in the legal and political language of the documents that have governed her life's last act. She arrives without the crown, without the son who would have worn it, without the husband who wore it, with no network of allies left, with none of the lands and incomes that a Queen of England should possess. She arrives with her life, which is what Louis paid for, and with whatever she carries inside that life, the experience and the intelligence and the dignity and the refusal, which is the constant across everything. The refusal to become smaller than the situation requires. Louis takes back most of the ransom money almost immediately, providing in exchange an annual pension that covers the basics of a modest establishment. This is Louis at his most characteristic. The man who pays exactly as much as it takes to acquire what he needs and immediately recovers whatever portion of it he can recover through the mechanisms available. She is not surprised. She has been dealing with Louis for more than a decade, and she knows his texture precisely. She takes the pension and establishes herself in the Loire Valley with the small court that the pension allows. And she begins the Las Vegas. The Loire Valley in the late 1470s is a gentler place for her return than it might have been. René is still alive, in his late 60s, still presiding over his court with the warmth and the creative energy that have always defined him, still writing and painting and organising the occasional tournament or spectacle that his finances allow and that his temperament cannot resist. There is comfort in finding him still there, still himself, still the father she has always known, the man who taught her by example that it is possible to lose everything and to continue being everything that you are. That the loss does not diminish the person, only the circumstances, and that the person is what ultimately matters. They spend time together in these years, father and daughter, in the relaxed way of people who have nothing urgent to accomplish, and all the time that remains to them to simply be in each other's company. She tells him things the sources occasionally suggest that she has not told anyone else. The private account of what the years were like that she has not felt free to give to any public audience, and that finds its audience in the one person who knew her before all of it began and who understands the full arc, what she has been through. He listens with the attentiveness that marks everything he does for the people he loves, the genuine attention that was always one of his most valuable qualities, and he does not offer solutions because there are no solutions. And he does not offer consolations that would feel cheap because he is too intelligent for cheap consolations. He simply listens, and his listening is the thing she needed. He dies in 1480 at the age of 71, and the household observances of grief are performed with the care that the relationship demands. She oversees the arrangements with the same exactness she has given to ceremony throughout her life, with attention to the details that matter, with a conviction that the forms of ceremony are not mere formality, but the way that significance is made visible and given its due weight. She buries him as he should be buried in the cathedral at Angers, and she mourns him as she has mourned everyone she has lost, which is privately and without public collapse, because public collapse has never been available to her and is not available now. She moves through the grief and comes out the other side of it into the final 2 years of her life, which are the quietest years she has ever known. Dampierre-sur-Loire, the small chateau in the Saumur country where she spends her final years, is not a place of grandeur. It is a place of adequacy, of enough space for the small household and the routines of a daily life that has contracted to its essentials. The chapel, the table, the garden in the summer, the fireside in the winter, the books, the correspondence with the dwindling number of people who are still in contact, the rhythms of the church's year that have always provided the scaffolding of her days. She is in her early 50s, which in the late 15th century is the threshold of genuine old age, and her body reflects the accumulated weight of 50 years of the kind of life she has led. She moves more slowly than she once did. She is tired in ways that rest does not entirely address. She is, in the word that covers a multitude of specific meanings, spent, not without resources of intelligence or will or character, but without the physical and perhaps the emotional reserves that the engagement of those resources requires. She dies on the 25th of August 1482. The date is known because it is recorded in the administrative documents of the Angers diocese that deal with the funeral arrangements, which are prepared with the care that her rank demands and that are carried out with the ceremony of a queen. She is buried in Angers Cathedral in the church of her father's city, in the valley of the Main where the Tuffo bluffs rise white from the water meadows, and the light is warm and long on summer evenings, and the river moves under its willows in the slow, patient way of rivers in country that has been at peace for long enough to settle into its own beauty. She is 52 years old. She has been Queen of England since she was 15. She spent 30 years fighting for the throne she was given and the son she bore to inherit it. And she lost both, and she survived both losses. And she died in a small chateau in the Loire Valley that was not England, surrounded by the few people who remained, and the world that recorded her passing had already begun to write its version of who she was. And that version would take 6 centuries and is not yet finished. What she leaves behind in Anjou at her death is not very much in material terms. The pension Louis gave her passes back to the French crown. The small household disperses. The letters she wrote and received over 50 years of political life survive only in fragments. The rest lost to the ordinary attrition of paper and time and the indifference of people who did not understand what they were holding. The chateaux she lived in have been rebuilt and renamed and changed beyond recognition. Her tomb is gone. Her books, scattered. The things that were hers are, for the most part, simply not there anymore. What is there is the record, the administrative accounts, the diplomatic dispatches, the chronicle entries, the legal documents, the occasional letter that survived when it should not have. And through that record, assembled and examined with the care it deserves, a woman comes into focus. Not the she-wolf, not the saint, not the tragic figure of romantic imagination, but a real person who lived a specific life and made specific choices and bore specific losses and kept going anyway. She kept going until she could not keep going. And then she stopped. And then she was here no longer. What remains is the record. Incomplete, contested, shaped by the hands of those who survived her, and yet still enough to know her by. The story she left behind is one that took the centuries a very long time to begin to see clearly, because the story she left was told for so long by the people who defeated her, and whose interest in the telling was not the truth of what she was, but the utility of what she could be made to represent. She-wolf of France is what Shakespeare calls her, in a line that distills a century of Tudor propaganda into 5 words: the foreign woman, the unnatural queen, the virago who usurped the male role, whose aggressive defence of her son's claim was read not as courage or maternal love or political intelligence, but as an offence against the natural order, as evidence that something was wrong with her at the level of her sex. This is the portrait that a Yorkist England, and then a Tudor England, found it useful to maintain. And it found it useful to maintain because it explained the failure of the Lancastrian cause in a way that preserved the dignity of the men involved. They were defeated not by the complexities of dynastic politics and the random quality of military fortune, but by a woman who wasn't acting as women should act. And their defeat by such a woman was therefore not quite a real defeat. More a category error, a misalignment of the universe that Edward IV and then Henry VII then righted. There is a particular quality to a legacy that has been systematically misread for several centuries and is only beginning to be recovered. And Margaret's legacy has that quality. The quality of something whose true outline has been obscured for so long that the outline itself looks surprising when it is finally revealed, as if the shape that emerges is not the one the centuries of commentary prepared you for. She was buried in 1482, and within a decade, a Tudor dynasty had taken the English throne, and the Tudors had their own reasons to manage the Lancastrian story carefully, because their own claim derived in part from the Lancastrian line and required them to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Lancastrian cause while also celebrating the resolution of the conflict that the Yorkist years represented. Margaret did not fit neatly into the Tudor narrative, because the Tudor narrative required a story in which the conflict had been a tragedy of division that Henry VII's accession healed. And Margaret's story is the story of someone who refused to treat the conflict as a tragedy to be healed, who treated it as a fight to be won, and who lost it with a tenacity and a ferocity that the Tudor narrative found easier to vilify than to explain. Shakespeare uses her across 4 plays, more stage time than almost any other historical figure in the canon. And the Margaret he creates is a figure of extraordinary theatrical power who bears a specific and recognizable relationship to the historical Margaret while serving, simultaneously, the specific dramatic purposes of the plays she inhabits. She is old and bitter and prophetic in the later plays, the voice of doom and retribution moving through the court of Richard III. Cursing the people who destroyed what she built, she is fierce and martial and politically dominant in the earlier ones. She is always, in Shakespeare, at the centre of whatever room she is in, filling it with an energy and an authority that his male characters frequently cannot match. The she-wolf line is his, and it is placed in the mouth of York before he dies at Wakefield, and it has lived in the cultural imagination ever since, as if it were a description rather than an insult. As if the thing York says about her, in the moment of his defeat, is the truth about her, rather than the defensive characterization of a man who is being beaten by someone he has been trained to expect to beat. The she-wolf as a concept is worth examining briefly before putting it down, because there is something in it that accidentally points towards something real. A wolf defends its territory and its young with ferocity disproportionate to any civilized calculation of what the situation merits. A wolf does not stop when the odds become unfavorable. A wolf is not interested in the conventions that govern the behavior of domestic animals. These are qualities that York and Shakespeare and the Tudor propagandists intend as criticism, as the designation of something inhuman and monstrous in the woman who displayed them. They are also, if you rotate them slightly, a description of someone who defended her family and her cause with everything she had, who continued past the point where continuing seemed rational, who was not bound by the conventions that said a woman in her position should defer, accept, and be grateful for whatever the men around her decided to allow. The criticism and the tribute are made of the same material. Only the frame changes. The most telling evidence against the she-wolf characterization is not the absence of proof for specific atrocities, though that absence is significant. It is the consistency of the testimony about her from people who actually knew her. The people who followed her into exile, who gave up their English estates and their English lives to remain with her, did not do this for a monster. They did it for someone who inspired the specific kind of loyalty that can only be produced by genuine quality. The loyalty of people who have chosen to be somewhere on the basis of their own assessment of the person they are choosing to follow. Warwick knelt before her for 15 minutes. She did not ask him to prostrate himself permanently. The arrangement she made was hard-headed and pragmatic, and ultimately in the service of her son's cause. The witch queens of later mythology do not negotiate, they command. Margaret spent her adult life in the unglamorous work of building coalitions, managing people, maintaining relationships under conditions of great difficulty, doing the actual operational work that keeping a cause alive requires. This is not the behavior of a monster, it is the behavior of a politician. The rehabilitation of her historical reputation begins seriously in the 20th century, with the scholarly work that applies to the 15th century, the analytical tools that the accumulation of documentary evidence and the development of historical method have made available. Helen Mora's biography, Helen Castor's work on women and power in the later medieval period, Diana Dunn's examination of her political role, these and the scholarly work around them have begun the process of reading the historical record more carefully, of distinguishing between what the sources actually contain and what they have been assumed to contain, of separating the Tudor myth from the documented reality. What a thorough reading reveals is broadly what this evening has been tracing. A woman of high intelligence and real political ability who operated in conditions that would have defeated almost anyone, who sustained a cause for 3 decades past, the point at which most causes would have ended, who lost in the end, but whose losing was not the simple thing that the mythology of her villainy required it to be. The academic rehabilitation has been accompanied, in more recent decades, by a cultural rehabilitation that takes different forms. Novels that reimagine her story from inside, plays and films that try to recover the human texture of what the documentary record only outlines. The general drift of cultural attention toward the women of history who were there but have not been read. She has become, in this more recent reckoning, one of the figures most frequently cited when people discuss the historical treatment of politically capable women. The way that the same qualities in a man and a woman are read as strength in one and as aberration in the other. The way that the she-wolf label is applied to women who do what men do in the same circumstances and are expected to be grateful for the application. She has become, in other words, useful to the present in a different way from the way she was useful to the Tudor past, and the usefulness says as much about the present as it does about her. What she might have made of this posthumous career we can only imagine. She was a serious and pragmatic woman who was not much given to self-mythologizing. The records of her actual speech and writing are records of someone who says what the situation requires and does not waste time on sentiment about it. She might have found the rehabilitation useful and the cultural appropriation somewhat beside the point. She might have preferred the simple truth of the record to the simplified heroics of the reimagining. She would have been right to prefer it, because the truth of the record, followed with full attention, is a richer and stranger thing than any simplification of it can convey. She was not the she-wolf. She was not the virtuous Lancastrian saint either. The martyred queen of later romantic mythology who suffered all and forgave all and represents the tragic nobility of lost causes. She was a woman who arrived in England at 15, speaking no English, in a kingdom that was structurally failing in ways that had nothing to do with her, married to a man who could not perform the central functions of kingship, and who decided, with a clarity and a consistency that held across 30 years of difficulty that would have broken most of the men around her, that her job was to perform those functions for him and to fight for her son's inheritance with every tool that the world would allow her to use. She was brilliant, and she was determined, and she was capable of real kindness and real warmth and real political intelligence, and she was also capable, when the situation required it, of the kind of ruthlessness that the politics of her period required, of anyone who was going to last within them. She was human, with the full complexity that human means, and she lived in a century that was not designed to accommodate women who were as capable as she was, and she pressed against its limits for 30 years without ever quite breaking through them. What she leaves is not a dynasty. The dynasty ended with her son in the fields outside Tewkesbury. What she leaves, more specifically, is a demonstration of what it looks like to maintain a political position for 30 years with no institutional support, no formal power, and no guarantee of outcome, in conditions built to prevent someone in her position from doing what she did, relying entirely on personal intelligence, personal loyalty, and the kind of sustained will that ordinary circumstances do not produce, and extraordinary circumstances sometimes require. Whether the cause was worth the cost is a question the evidence cannot answer for us. She believed it was, and she acted on that belief without detectable wavering, from the moment she understood what her situation required of her until the moment the options ran out. What she leaves is a story about what it costs to refuse to stop, about the particular quality of the person who continues past the point where continuing seems rational, who finds in the continuation itself a form of meaning that the outcomes cannot fully address. She continued for 30 years and she lost. But she continued, and the continuing is its own kind of testament to something in the human spirit that the winning and losing does not entirely explain. We are still talking about her here, tonight, in the small hours of whatever morning this has become for you, because she was too vivid and too determined and too extraordinary to be simply forgotten by the world she passed through, and because the questions her life raises about power and legitimacy, and the treatment of capable women in positions that the formal world does not officially permit them to hold, are questions that have not been resolved and may not be resolved in any era, that relies on formal structures to do the resolving. She marked it, and it marked her, and we are all of us the inheritors of both marks, still trying to understand what they mean and why the understanding continues to matter. That is what tonight was for. Sleep well. Now. Sleep well with the thought of her, that young woman on the shore at Weymouth, the news not yet in her hands, the decision not yet made, the weight of everything already accumulated behind her, and the full weight of what is still to come, not yet known. There is a particular quality to a moment like that, standing at the edge of knowledge before the knowledge arrives, that belongs to the courageous and the stubborn in equal measure. She had both in abundance. There is something in that moment, in the last breath before the news arrives, that holds the whole shape of a life. She draws the breath, she stands on the shore, and the cold sea is behind her. And England is spread out ahead of her. She does not know yet what the next hours hold. She waits to know what she will have to do next, and whatever it is, she will do it without hesitation. She always has. Let that be with you as you sleep. If this evening has meant something to you, if Margaret of Anjou's story is one you will carry with you into tomorrow, please share this episode with someone else who might find their way here through it. The few hours we have spent here together tonight across the full length of her extraordinary life are hours I will not forget, and I hope you will not forget them either. Subscribe if you have not yet, and leave me a word in the comments about where you are and what tonight has been like for you. Because the range of places and lives from which people listen to these episodes is one of the things I find most remarkable about what we are doing here together. I read every one, and I will be here again when you need somewhere quiet to go. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.